Hey, over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's there's just it's there. It's there for you. And it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff. And you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great. In the Thom Hartmann Book Club today, our book is Guns Down: How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Future with Fewer Guns by Igor Volsky. This is from the preface. Shooting Guns in the Desert Can Surprise You is the title. We don't teach people how to shoot, we teach them how to think. Mike, the second in command at one of the nation's largest firearms training institutes, tells me over an early dinner. We were at a country club 20 miles north of the gun range where I just spent the last 2 days firing 200 rounds of ammunition and learning how to safely carry and operate a handgun. A tall, distinguished-looking man who bears a slight resemblance to former President George H.W. Bush, Mike is wearing a yellow polo shirt, neat, clean khakis, and a belt with a holstered handgun and 2 full magazines. As we sit in front of a beautiful Rocky Mountain backdrop, the tops of which will be covered with snow in a matter of months, I take a big swig of coffee and search for a tactful way to ask Mike the question that's been swirling around my brain since my first day of training at the Firearms Institute. I finally blurted out, "I still don't understand why you're lying to your clients." A silence falls over our table. As Mike looks away from me, I look directly at him and wait for him to respond. 48 hours earlier, I had boarded a plane to learn how to shoot a handgun from the best instructors in the business. The opportunity arose through my friend Sam, not his real name, who in the course of my writing this book has become my guide to the world of firearm enthusiasts. Sam invited me to travel to the Southwest and experience a 2-day firearm training course with people he described as the best instructors in the world. I will take it with you, and then after, you can interview all the trainers, he said. They all hate the NRA. He'd arranged for the range to comp me the 2-day course and rental equipment, plus complete access to the other students, instructors, and its leadership team. Sam, a white, boyish, fast-talking ex-Marine and hardcore gun enthusiast, had passionately pitched the idea to me by phone months earlier. "You'll love it and really get a taste for what it's all about. Meet some great people, and I'll do it with you," he said. Fashioning myself as an open-minded and adventurous person, I jumped at the chance. Surround myself with 600 armed Americans and thousands of rounds of ammunition for 2 full days of gun shooting in the hot desert? Sign me up. What could possibly go wrong? So there I am, a city slicker who hasn't sat behind the wheel of a car in 3 or 4 years, driving my fully insured economy rental car literally into a desert at sunrise one Friday morning in October. I'm blasting a local hit station with the windows rolled down, singing at the top of my lungs in an effort to wake myself up enough to handle a handgun. Yes, I'm belting out Sia while doing 70 down a dirt road without another car in sight. As I get closer, I turn off the radio, make the right turn, and take a deep, deep breath. Ahead of me, I see a line of cars about 30 deep and a large sign displaying the logo of the Institute. Next to it is a larger placard, "Warning, unsafe to enter without authorization, live fire training area, risk of severe bodily injury or death." I've arrived. Before I know it, I'm on a 500-acre compound in the middle of the mountains. I drive up to the parking lot, suddenly overcome by the vastness of this place, and pull into a spot. Sam meets me and tells me that more than 600 people will be taking 20 different classes at the Institute that day, most of which involve handguns and rifles. After lunch, classes on automatic machine guns will be available. My eyes grow wide at the idea of even being near a machine gun. I smile at him and look around to see people carrying coolers and equipment, behaving as if they're at an amusement park or some kind of sporting event. This is my first feeling of panic, of being found out as an interloper, or worse, a spy, in a foreign world. We move into a line for equipment rentals, and Sam points out the people in the best tactical outfits and reviews their looks. Finally, something I can get into. Sam himself is decked out in a slick black shirt, which accentuates his military build, and inverted cargo pants with pockets that expand into the leg, an outfit suited for concealed carry, he tells me. Everyone around us is wearing a variation of this military-style clothing, and I realize that these are specialty clothes designed for recreational firearms shooting. Some even have custom hats with their names embroidered on the front and back as if they're actually serving in the military. These folks are really hardcore. It really has become a lifestyle, Sam says to me. I glance down at my jeans and bright red sneakers and realize I've made a horrible mistake. As if reading my mind, he says, "You're just fine," and starts to examine the kit the young attendant who has just handed me, making sure I have everything I need. We move forward along toward a long row of tables where staffers are inspecting all weapons and ammunition. It's his first time here, Sam says. Magazines, 200 rounds of ammunition, safety goggles, electronic ear protection, holsters, you got it all. The inspector says it's mostly for my benefit. I smile and make a mental note that those things that hold the bullets are called magazines, not clips, and oh, by the way, it's rounds, not bullets. Okay, lift your hands up, the attendant says. Before I know it, he and Sam are putting a belt around my waist and sliding the ammunition holder and gun holster onto it. The inspector confidently drops a Glock 17 into the gun holster on my right side, the firing side, and I'm carrying a firearm for the very first time in my life. As Sam and I start to walk away, I try to decide if I feel any different. Suddenly, the inspector calls out after us. "Wait, are you the Sam?" he asks. Sam turns around and smiles. "I've seen your videos and stuff," the inspector enthusiastically tells him, becoming a starstruck fangirl right before our eyes. The book is Guns Down by Igor Volsky.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you on this beautiful, rainy, gray Monday here from Portland. Do we need a Marshall Plan for Central America? I mean, this all kind of wraps up with Kirstjen Nielsen being kicked out of the Department of Homeland Security. Apparently, she went into this meeting with Donald Trump over the weekend to, well, actually, nobody's really sure what the goal of the meeting was. But she went into this meeting, and he apparently started yelling at her, and she had brought with her a letter of resignation that she was going to present to him if he was apparently as obnoxious as he normally is. And we've heard this story from lots and lots of people, pretty much everybody who has spoken, who has ever been in the White House, that he likes to scream, he likes to shout obscenities, he likes to belittle people, he likes to humiliate them. And, you know, that's just like the price of being able to have your name go down in history as a member of the cabinet of a president of the United States. You know, you want to be up there with Madison and Hamilton and you know, and whatnot. Well, Madison was also a president, but, you know, Hamilton, Burr. Yeah, that's the price you have to pay. So anyhow, she went in, she brought her letter of resignation, and Trump started yelling at her, and before she could even say, "I quit," and pull the letter out, he said, "You're fired." And then he tweeted it before she could release her letter to the press. You know, she's walking out of her office or out of the office or, you know, something close to that, he tweets it. So what's going on here? Well, it turns out that she's just not being brutal enough. The Trump administration, after John Kelly and Stephen Miller came up with this brilliant idea, and Kirstjen Nielsen, of course, was John Kelly's protege. She used to work for him over at the Pentagon, and he brought her along, and then she became DHS secretary. Their brilliant idea was people are coming here from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador because they are fleeing basically brutality in those three countries. Those three countries were so badly broken by Elliott Abrams and his buddies in the Reagan administration. Elliott Abrams, the same guy who was convicted during the Iran-Contra investigations and then was pardoned by President George Herbert Walker Bush at the recommendation of Bill Barr, who's now our Attorney General. He was the Attorney General back then, too, in 1992. Elliot Abrams, who was pardoned, convicted war criminal, right, who was pardoned, is now in charge of our Venezuela policy. So expect a war in Venezuela any day now. But in any case, what happened was we broke these three countries. We deposed a democratically elected president in one. We supported a right-wing government in another. We helped build death squads in a third. And all three of these countries, now, you know, the country that's actually closest to us, south of Mexico, is Belize. But Belize back in the 80s, when Reagan was president, was still on the tail end of their whole English colonial thing, sort of like Canada was over the last 50 years or so. And there were still British troops in Belize, so Reagan didn't mess with Belize. Belize is doing just fine, thank you very much. Cruise ships go there, right? It's a vacation destination. Not so much for Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. We broke these countries. So now as refugees are fleeing these countries, literally fleeing for their lives, coming to the United States, families. This is not you know, your 20-something, working age, good, you know, healthy young man looking for a job. That's who used to come across our border. People like that have not come across our border since 2008. We've actually seen mostly Mexicans leaving the United States in larger numbers than they're coming into the United States, people who are looking for work. And in fact, that might be one of the reasons why our unemployment rate is so low right now, is because so many, quote, illegal immigrants have actually left this country. But the people who are coming to this country are families, mostly mothers and their children. And so the policy that Kirstjen Nielsen and John Kelly and Donald Trump and mostly Stephen Miller. Steve Miller is like the white supremacist in chief in the White House. This guy who was like just has this weird high school history of racism and just bizarre humanness. The guy who puts spray hair on his head before he goes on Face the Nation. This guy came up with this policy of let's just brutalize these families, these women and children, and the word will spread down to Central America that, you know, America's policy is just terrible. You don't want to go there, and fewer people will come. Well, they brutalized them. They tore apart thousands. We got something like 13,000 children being held right now in cages in prisons in the United States. Private prisons, very profitable business for buddies of the Trump administration. They're being paid hundreds of dollars per day per child to lock them in cages. So we did that. Many of these children have been lost into the system. God only knows how many have been sold or traded or bartered or something on the National Child Exchange, whatever it is. I mean, it's truly bizarre. They literally can't find many of these children. No idea where they are. And so the message of our brutality got down to Central America, and they were like, you know, I'd rather have my kid in foster care. I'd rather be sitting in jail than be dead, because that's what so many of them are facing, or be tortured or be raped. I mean, these are the things that these people are facing, literally. So what's Trump's response? Well, the 2020 election is coming. And him and Stephen Miller have decided that they know that the white racist vote is what got them in. So the winning message is going to be, brown people are coming from south of the border. It's a screaming epidemic. We got to do something. Now, the fact of the matter is the number of brown people crossing the border is, yeah, it's higher now than it was a year ago, but it's radically lower. It's like 1/5 of what it was in 2000. It's a relatively tiny number. There is not a crisis at the southern border. But Donald Trump needs one. He needs a crisis in order to get himself reelected, in order to activate the racist vote, the white supremacist vote, the Stephen Miller vote. So how do we do that? How do we create a crisis south of the border? Hey, let's cut off foreign aid, the aid that we're providing to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, to support democratic institutions. Let's cut off the aid to support their courts and police systems. Let's cut off the aid to support their programs of assistance for farmers who are being pushed off their farms because global warming is literally causing desertification. What used to be farmlands are becoming deserts in Central America right now. literally global warming is part of this problem, although the biggest part of the problem is, you know, what Reagan did and Elliott Abrams, who's now in charge of our Venezuela policy, did back in the 80s. So now they've got this Sophie's Choice program that they're floating, right? The Sophie's Choice program is, okay, you are arrested with your children. You're put in detention for 20 days. Now, the law says after 20 days, you can't be detained anymore with your children. So we're going to tell you, okay, you've got a choice. You can continue being detained with your children voluntarily, which the law provides for, or you can surrender your children and we'll find another home for them. We'll, you know, put them into the adoption market. Maybe we'll sell them. I don't know. We'll put them in foster care. We'll send them off to children's jails. I don't know what we're going to do with them, but this is your choice, right? It's Sophie's Choice. This is obscene. So my thought is what we need is a Marshall Plan for these three countries. We broke these three countries. You know, we broke Europe during World War II. Now, you could say, you know, our breaking of Central America was something that was entirely voluntary, essentially. It wasn't necessary. You know, Reagan did this because these countries were going socialist, right? I mean, the big crime, as I recall, of Guatemala was that they were building out something like a Medicare for All program, God forbid, and Social Security. We can't have socialism in this hemisphere, so we had to take them down. So we destroyed these countries. Well, we destroyed Germany during World War II, too. And what did we do after World War II? We loaned them the money to rebuild. We gave them grants. We gave them loans. We didn't do the rebuilding ourselves. We let them do it so that they built local industries to help rebuild. We should be doing the same thing with Central America. But no, Donald Trump has cut off all the funding for Central America. Why? Because that's going to create more of a crisis. And over the course of the next year, see, he needs 1 million refugees at the border in September and October of 2020 in order to win the election in November, in order to convince even the white people with a little bit of latent racism that, oh my God, they're coming. This is what he's doing. This is absolutely obscene. And we should be talking about this. You know, a couple of the Democratic presidential candidates have talked about we need a Marshall Plan for Central America. I absolutely think we do. Meanwhile, Kristen Nielsen, I started out by telling you how she got fired. And according to the law, I mean, literally the laws, U.S. Code 6 U.S. Code 113 subset G. The law says that if the Secretary of Homeland Security leaves her job, which is what just happened, or will happen on Wednesday, actually. If she leaves her job, her second in command becomes the person in charge, becomes the new Secretary of Homeland Security. Well, the second in command job has never been filled. Donald Trump, you know, doesn't give a rat's ass about bureaucracies or democracies or government. And so it goes to number 3. The number 3 is the Undersecretary of Management, Claire Grady. I don't know anything about Claire Grady except that Claire, and I'm assuming this is a female Claire, that she is a long-term employee of the department. In other words, she's the logical choice, right? She knows what she's doing. She's been there for a while. But Trump is not going to do that. He says he's going to put Kevin McAleenan. I think it's McAleenan. Anyhow, he's going to put him in charge. And temporarily, because he needs to get a real hard-nosed guy in there. Right? Somebody who's willing to do more than just brutalize children. I don't know, what are we going to start firing squads? Well, you know, we did shoot tear gas across the border. So, you know, what's going on there? And by the way, my suggestion of a Marshall Plan for Central America, guess who's doing that? China. China is pouring money right now into Panama and Peru and other countries in South America and Central America. Venezuela, $62 billion from China. Brazil, $42 billion from China. Argentina, $18 billion from China. Ecuador, $17 billion from China. China is reaching out across the world. But us, no, we're too stupid.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Or at least the guy we've got in the White House is too stupid. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. It's 18 minutes past the hour. And welcome back, Dave in Inverness, Florida. Hey, Dave, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
For a long time, and Free Speech TV, there was a guy that used to be on. He wrote a book, but maybe you ought to have John Perkins come in and explain how he used to affect foreign policy down there.
Yeah, John is the author of Confessions of a something or other hitman, economic hitman.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I've known John for years. He's been on this program a number of times, Dave.
Oh, okay.
Well, what's the point you were calling to make?
Well, that's the point. We're the ones that make these countries an S-hole country.
Yeah.
With our foreign policy.
Yeah, it really is. And by the way, apropos of that word, and thank you for not saying the whole word,
right.
Louise and I went to see Marvel over the weekend, the new, Marvel action movie that's got a woman as the hero.
Yeah. And
have you seen it, Dave?
No, I haven't.
Oh, this is incredible. I mean, it's really a movie made for teenagers, but it's a great movie. But it's got all these hits on Trump in it. It starts out, like the kind of white nationalist bad guys are sitting around talking about planet Earth, and they call it an S-hole planet. And then they start talking about there's this other race that they're having this war with, and they start talking about infestations. And I mean, they're literally borrowing language from Stephen Miller and Donald Trump. But anyhow, back to you, Dave. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I'm very well aware of it. But remember his last book he just wrote. It says that he added a new chapter to it because they're using the same techniques on us.
You're talking about John Perkins.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And he's said that in this program, that the economic hitman. I'm sorry, go ahead.
They depressed us when they shipped my job. I'm an engineer. They shipped my job to Mexico, and then it went from Mexico to China. And it gets me talking about this whole foreign policy thing, like it was a NAFTA free trade agreement, North Atlantic free trade agreement. Tom, I always thought it should be ratified by Congress like war, because and they should call them treaties, not trade deals. It was Nixon that started this.
You're absolutely right, David. It did start with Nixon, and it's because he couldn't get his deal with China through that he was actually doing on behalf of Pepsi Cola, who was spiffing him. And
oh, geez.
Yeah, that's where it all began. Nixon wanted some money from Pepsi.
I remember. I always wondered what Henry Kissinger promised the Chinese when he said, they're going to make them rich men. So,
yeah, well, yeah. So Nixon wanted to cut this. He wanted to, quote, open China to America. Congress wasn't having it. The Constitution clearly says that only Congress, actually only the Senate, can ratify treaties. And that's Nixon, right. With 2/3 of a vote, Nixon couldn't get 2/3 of the senators to support opening economically to a communist country. And so he came up with this thing called trade authority and got that passed as law with a simple majority. And then that requires a simple majority of both houses, actually, in this case, to ratify these trade deals. And thus we got NAFTA, and then we got CAFTA, and then we got the South Korean, and all these deals. And I agree with you, Dave. I think all of these deals are illegal. They're all unconstitutional. And every single one of them should be redone as a treaty and should be ratified by the Senate, because that's what treaties are for, as it says in the Constitution.
My experience, Tom, when I was working for a Fortune 500 company in Toledo, Ohio, I'm from Toledo, they sold, to circumvent the law, we couldn't have trade with China. So what they did, and I know it for a fact because we sent them the drawings of our plant, our machinery, and they formed another corporation with a company in Belgium.
Right.
They make aspirins. I won't mention
that company.
Either,
yeah. So it got laundered, basically, is what's going on. Dave, thanks for sharing your story with us. It's great to hear from you. I appreciate it. We'll be right back. And welcome back. So China's construction binge, I started off on this just as we were hitting the break. It used to be that American foreign policy was, about making the world safe for democracy, and implicit in that, or secondary to that, was making the world safe for capitalism. And, we used to practice a little gentler form of capitalism, although it was still pretty brutal. But, we allowed for things like labor unions and whatnot. And then came the Reagan presidency. And when Central American countries started talking about things like labor unions or Medicare or Social Security Reagan was like, oh, you can't do that. Are you kidding? We've got to have dictators. We've got to have death squads. We've got to make Central America safe for big corporations. But, you know, it used to be that we would extend aid to countries like we did with Europe. Now, I realize there were banana republics. There were countries that we oppressed. Honduras was one of them. I mean, back, you know, literally that's where the phrase banana republic came from, was United Fruit Company's behavior in both Honduras and in Hawaii. And, you know, and that was during the Eisenhower administration and some during the Kennedy administration. But at its core, those countries that we wanted to have as allies long term, and I think we're way past the Monroe Doctrine, right? That anything that happens in the Western Hemisphere is our business, right? That hasn't flown for 50 years. And so we have to reach out to these countries and say, we would like to be strategic allies with you. And how do you do that? You help them build democratic institutions. You help them rid themselves of the drug cartels and the death squads and the right-wing dictators and the phony baloney mayors and governors who are actually owned by the local drug cartels. You help build the institutions of democracy. We need a 21st century Marshall Plan that starts with Central America. The refugees on our southern border, Donald Trump sees refugees, and by the way, we need to stop the media from calling them migrants. These people are not migrants. They are refugees. They are fleeing. They are seeking refuge. They are not immigrants who are seeking, you know, a life in a different country. Just, you know, hey, let's pick a country. No, these are refugees. And Donald Trump wants an explosion of refugees on our southern border so that he can get himself reelected in 2012. Or 2020, excuse me. And by the way, little scary news. This from CNBC, Thomas Frank writing, 70%. They did a survey of the smartest people on Wall Street, right? And I put smartest in quotes. Let's say the richest people on Wall Street, the people on Wall Street who are actually making money. And they asked them, who do you think is going to win the 2020 election? And if it's a Democrat, what Democrat would you like to see? What Democrat would you most like to see, least like to see? And what the masters of the universe, the billionaires on Wall Street, 70% of them, 7 out of 10 of them, said that Donald Trump is going to get reelected. 70%. And then continuing, this is the RCB's head of U.S. equity strategy wrote to clients, quote, Joe Biden is the most acceptable Democratic candidate by the stock market for the White House. No other candidate got a significant number of votes. Elizabeth Warren is seen by the majority as the least acceptable Democratic candidate by Wall Street. But anyhow, you know, Trump wants to have this crisis on the border. He's creating it himself. We need to use this as an opportunity to fix our foreign policy.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's time to have a Marshall Plan, a rebuilding plan for Central America to undo, it's a kind of reparations, undoing the damage that Reagan did. How do we do that, though? For our book club today, we're reading from a book edited by Cynthia McKinney. It's a compiled collection of essays titled How the U.S. Creates, shall we say, S-hole countries. I can't say that word on the air. And this is from her introduction, a deeper look at Trump's epithet, S-hole country. I wish I could take full credit for the idea of doing a book on President Trump's unfortunate characterization of some countries as S-hole countries, verified recently by fired ex-White House staffer Omarosa Manigault. The idea was brought to me by a Facebook friend, and I immediately saw the brilliance of that idea. Although at the time the president tried to walk back the revelation that he used such language to describe certain countries, he couldn't help himself. And during the visit of Nigeria's president to the White House, He doubled down on that characterization, saying that certain countries were tough places to live. It was only recently that Omarosa confirmed that, yes, the president had described certain countries as asshole countries. The media had a field day with the, at the time, alleged remarks. Steve Dempsey of the Bay Area News Group compiled a slideshow of cartoons from national news outlets that lambasted the president. Lambasted, whatever it is. The Mercury News Online ran the slideshow that included hilarious cartoons by Rick McKee at the Augustus Chronicle and Bob Englehart with Kago Cartoons and others. Mark Schuller, writing in the Huffington Post, noted, Haiti has been targeted for its decisive role in challenging what Southern planters, including 8 U.S. presidents, called a peculiar institution. The Haitian Revolution was the first time slaves were able to permanently end slavery and forge an independent nation. It was also a tipping point in U.S. history, leading to the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, paving the way for U.S. manifest destiny stretching from sea to shining sea and eventual dominance. Chicago, the country's third largest city, was founded by a Haitian, Jean-Baptiste Pont-du-Sable, or Sable, who Haitian historian Mark Rosier called an agent of the Haitian government to pursue a pro-freedom international policy. End of quote from that. Jen Kirby went farther, and in an online media outlet, Vox, interview with a Stanford University history professor, the word eugenics was used as a descriptor for what Trump's characterization actually represented. Stanford professor Anna Minion said of the interview, what Trump said was basically a form of eugenics, in which he's saying, this is the population we want, people from places like Norway, white people. We don't want people from African countries or from Haiti. That's what's really symbolic here. Minion makes it clear that in the U.S. immigration debate, legality became a proxy for race without anyone overtly talking about it. Ryan Teague Beckwith and Maya Roden of Time magazine added their 2 cents worth to the discussion of the president's choice of words by choosing to discuss the immigration laws that occasioned Trump's telling words. They began the discussion this way. President Donald Trump's S-hole countries comment ricocheted around the world, spurring criticism from U.S. allies, rebuttals from Americans with roots in those countries, and condemnation from some in his own party. Reaction was swift around the world, including from those countries so characterized by the president. Zambia even humorously featured Trump's words in a tourism advertisement at Appeal. My Facebook friend thought that the president's words should occasion a deeper look at what these so-called S-hole countries were, how they were created, and why they continue to exist. And that is exactly what the contributors to this book do. Sort of like the proverbial turtle sitting on a fence post, you know these countries didn't get the way they are without some help. And it's precisely that help from the U.S., its allies, its multinational corporations, its military, and United Nations peacekeeping operations in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which it also controls, on which this book focuses. Thus, the U.S. relationship to conditions in these countries is clear from U.S. military occupation of Haiti, financing of death squads in El Salvador, and support for dictators in all of them, indeed, all across the African continent. Therefore, for our purposes, an S-hole country is a country whose residents present quality of living conditions that can be tied to historical or current U.S. foreign and military policies that have negatively impacted the ability of that state to deliver quality of life policies to its residents. In this regard, for too many U.S. residents, the U.S. itself could be characterized as an S-hole country, resulting from its deliberate choice to fund the war machine and corporate policies that produce negative consequences for the countries and territories, in some cases colonies, that are profiled here. The United States, as itself a S-hole country, could be explored in much depth in future efforts. The characterization of certain countries as S-hole countries has captured the imagination of the global community, whether the localities and individuals concerned are for or against U.S. President Donald J. Trump. This book seizes this unique moment when attention of people inside and outside the U.S. is focused on the president's alleged words to explain the structure of international politics, the conditions inside certain countries, specific U.S. policies that created or maintain those conditions, and the consequence of those policies on U.S. residents themselves. How the U.S. Creates S-Hole Countries by Cynthia McKinney, or edited by.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back, 34 minutes past the hour. So China is reaching out across the planet, building alliances based on economics, right? Which, I mean, if you look at the history of the United States, one of the things that you find in terms of presidential elections is that when the economy is doing well, presidents tend to get reelected. When the economy is doing poorly, presidents tend to get kicked out and replaced. I mean, it's axiomatic. It's a simple rule that I can't think of any exceptions to, frankly. And, you know, economics is what people feel. It's, you know, do I have a job or not? Can I buy things? Is my money any good? You know, do I have a future? Will my children do better than me? All these things. This is economics. And economics drives politics more than anything else. And the Chinese get this, and they're reaching across the world. And instead of saying to Ecuador, instead of saying, let us build a military base or we'll bomb you or we'll send death squads in, like we say to, you know, Honduras, they're saying, hey, would you like $17 billion? Because that's how much they've loaned to Ecuador to build airports and ports and roads. They're building, literally, these are infrastructure projects. In the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago are doing this. The founder of Panama's most influential newspaper, La Prensa, is a guy named Roberto Eisenman, excuse me. And he pointed out that Panama now no longer recognizes Taiwan as an independent country. They're saying, oh, yeah, Taiwan, that's part of China, which is what the Chinese want. He said, you know, he's talking about this, and he says they are leaving a vacuum of leadership, they being the United States, that obviously the Chinese are trying to fill. This was started in 2012, this Belt and Road Initiative. Meanwhile, here in the United States, we're doing the America First Initiative, which means trash everybody, especially countries that aren't filled with white people. Alina in Seattle. Hey, Alina, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. You were talking about Sophie's Choice, and I'm originally from Russia. This is so much like what Stalin did.
How so?
Well, he would arrest people and put them in concentration camps, and then he would take their children away. And if they were not lucky to have any relatives to take them, he would put them in foster care and change their name.
Wow.
So that when the parents got out, they could not find them.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible.
This is one more step the Trump administration hasn't taken yet, as far as we know.
Yeah, although, you know, how many of these children might have gotten adopted or whatever? I mean, you know, geez, it's incredible. Elena, thank you.
Yeah, my grandfather, my great-grandmother was put in the concentration camp for 20 years because she was married to an enemy of the people who was executed. And my grandfather was lucky to have an aunt. And so she took him in, and when his mother got out, he was able to find her because they didn't change his name. So.
And enemy of the people, was that a journalist or was that a political activist? Or do you not know?
He was in the war, and they thought that he betrayed USSR.
Yeah, interesting. Elena, thank you for sharing that story with us. It's extraordinary. I appreciate the call. And, boy, people's personal... Whew. Michael in Denver. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. Good morning.
Morning.
Hey, I just wanted to add to the discourse. You've already mentioned some of the things that I wanted to bring to the discourse here, but I just wanted to say that one of the things that we need to do is to continually bring to the fore what American diplomacy has been. I'm going to say since, the beginning of the 20th century at least, where we've propped up dictators all over, the world basically for economic reasons, and also to have, the checkerboard across the planet of American might, military might. I'm part Cuban American, and I grew up in a household after the revolution. I grew up in a household which was totally against Fidel Castro and the regime. Now I'm 70 years old, and after going through that, that experience, I've found that although no one is perfect, what had to happen in Cuba had to happen because what was going on, that was basically an American oligarchy on the island controlled everything.
Right, Batista.
Yeah, Batista and all. I hate to put it in these terms, but if you were to watch the Godfather 2 movie, there's just a lot. It's fictionalized, but it's fictionalized after real facts of what was going on in Cuba with the setting up of the casinos down there and all the luxury that was going to be basically for American and other countries, capitalistic countries and all that. It dragged down. I was there just before the revolution, took hold, and I remember the bombs going off like they did in the movies, and stuff like that. We've done this all over the planet, Tom. Yeah. And now the chickens are coming. Who was it? Malcolm X. The chickens are coming home to roost.
Yep.
And I'm just going to end with this, Tom. I really honestly think that this is the end of the American experiment. 241 years of what was an imperfect, but what a magnificent document the Constitution is, and how we declared independence, from Europe, the European oligarchs at that time. But I honestly think it's over, Tom. I really don't have a whole hell of a lot of hope. Yeah. How are we going to take control of things when we have literally, almost another planet size of an economy that just goes against, the will of the people and the freedom and the health of the people. Yeah. That's all I wanted to say.
I'm not ready, Michael. I absolutely get everything you're saying, and there are times, particularly when I look at what Mitch McConnell's doing with our courts, which is going to have a shocking and lasting impact that is not going to sink into people for probably about a year, maybe two. Probably after the election, that you're going to start seeing these judges start just issuing these wackadoodle orders, crazy right-wing stuff. But I'm not ready to write the obituary for the United States or for the American experiment, because where we're at right now is not that different from where we were at in the 1920s. Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, those three presidents. Harding was elected, the top tax rate was 91% when Harding ran for president, and there was heavy regulation in the banking industry because of the crash of 1897. And Harding came in on two slogans, cutting taxes, and when he became president, he cut the top tax rate from 91% down to 25% in 1921, and what he called more government, more industry and government, less government and industry. In other words, privatize and deregulate. Right. And he did those things, and that kicked off the Roaring '20s, which was actually a time of increasing poverty among working people, but radical explosions of wealth at the top, particularly in the top 5%. And that led directly to the crash of 1929, and that led to Franklin Roosevelt and the progressive era. And when I look at the Democratic candidates, the Democratic field, about half of them, and with really a good solid chance of winning, about half of them are solid progressives. They are in the mold of Franklin Roosevelt. And I think that this election is our last chance.
Well, I agree with you, Tom, because it just seems like we have the right minds and the right people and also the right gender right now, I think, to lead this country. So I agree with you, on that point, and I hope we can take this car that we're in and get off this highway and get on the right highway.
Yeah, I'm with you. Michael, thank you. Very well said, and thanks for sharing your story with us. Joan in Pittston, Pennsylvania, listening on WSTE. Hey, Joan, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I'm a big fan of your show, and I'm really enjoying it, especially today, because you talk about so many things that I want to be listening to. But I need you to help me fight the water cooler war. Mm-hmm. Okay. I live in Pennsylvania, and I have to tell you, the area where I live, near Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, very, very pro-Trump, the media anyway,
right.
And very, very against immigration. I mean, people are getting downright nasty around here.
Sure.
With
it's happening all over the country, Jean. Yeah.
It's awful. And my problem is when I think about it, when they say asylum seekers can come into the country, there is a part of me, as a progressive, as a democratic socialist, as a radical, that is like, well, where is everybody going to go? And is it just going to become like a new Browning of America? Which is, I'm not saying that's good or bad, it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
But, like, where is everybody going to go? What would be a sane way to let asylum seekers in and people that want to better their lives and save their lives?
There's two responses to your question, Jean. One is, there's plenty of room in the United States. There's plenty of land. If you look at dense population areas like the Northeast corridor, for example, where you've got, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of people per square mile, and compare the resources to places like that, to places like, the Midwest or the Western states. There is plenty of land, there's plenty of resources. The United States, our population is 340 million more or less right now. We could easily add a couple 100 million people gradually, and it wouldn't make any difference. And in fact, that's what we were on course to do. I mean, we were only 200 million people in 1950, and now we're over 340. But that said, we were on course to do that mostly through birth. And births, as women have gotten rights, particularly reproductive rights, births have flattened and in fact declined slightly. And so what's happening is that the new blood that's coming into the country is immigrant blood, and historically we've welcomed about 1 million immigrants a year. I mean, since the 20s, and Trump wants to cut that back radically now that his wife has become a successful immigrant, and she was the anchor baby for her parents. Her parents now are successful immigrants. Now that he's got, his white family here, then it's like close the doors now, right? So
yeah, sure.
So that's the one thing, that it's not going to be a problem. But the other thing is, it's not going to be a problem technically, but the other thing is the cultural impact and the political impact.
Right.
And that is that when you have people coming into your country who do not share your language, and to some extent do not share your culture. Now, I would argue that Mexican culture and American culture are not that different. They're both what you would call Western civilization. And that, the Catholicism carried by most Mexican and Central American immigrants is not that different from even the Protestantism that dominates the United States. The major difference is racial, right? That 70 some odd % of Americans are European ancestry, white people basically, and we're seeing now 17% of our population is Hispanic and 13% is African American, and as those numbers increase, then you start to see backlash, and there is a measurable number, a measurable % of people who are quote, not like us, I guess would be how most countries would describe it. A measurable percentage of immigrants that can be accepted into a country every single year without causing backlash. And that's people who can come into the country and be assimilated and become part of the culture, so that by the second generation they're talking like Americans, they're thinking like Americans, even though they may speak a second language, they may still, and obviously they still look like they're not European ancestry, but they have basically integrated themselves into the American culture and mainstream. That historically was the case, and I think largely still is the case. I think Trump is exaggerating this. That's not what happened in several European countries. It's not what happened when Germany took 1 million people from the refugees that came through Libya, many of them Syrians. It's not what happened when Sweden took them. And so you've got these major right-wing white nationalist backlash movements going on in those countries. The one in this country is more just good old-fashioned racism. I'm frankly not all that concerned about it, Gene, but we do need to be thinking in those terms. That's why we need comprehensive immigration reform.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Thanks, Gene. That was a great question. We'll be right back. It's 48 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. Ed in Klamath Falls, Oregon. Hey, Ed, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I think you misunderstand Trump's take on Central America. He's looking for a return on investment. That's what he considers foreign aid to be, or an investment, and he wants to get a return on it, and he doesn't want the return to be uneducated banana pickers.
Well, no, it's the other way around. The return, you know, that investment that we made in those three countries post-Reagan policies was explicitly in the law, I mean explicitly, to help them stabilize their countries so as not to be sending refugees into our country or into Mexico or both. And that's why Trump is cutting off the foreign aid to those countries. He wants more refugees on the southern border so that he can campaign against brown people coming into our country. This is the Stephen Bannon strategy. Stephen Bannon is traveling around Europe right now, teaching largely white European countries how, you know, right-wing, you know, wannabe politicians in those countries, teaching them how to demonize black and brown people and people of other religions, principally Islam, how to demonize them in their countries. And that's what Donald Trump is doing here. But he doesn't have enough Hispanics in the United States to really totally demonize them. There's not enough Hispanic crime in the United States. There's not enough people crossing the southern border that he can say, hey, we have a crisis, and any news media with any integrity at all will say, yes, there's a crisis. And so he's got to create a crisis, and that's why he's cutting off foreign aid to these countries, Ed.
No, I don't agree. I think that he's cutting off foreign aid to the world because he's thinking about return on investment strictly. He's a businessman, and he's looking for a return on his investment, a good bottom line return.
So what's a good, in your mind, what's a good bottom line return on an investment in the Northern Triangle countries, in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador?
Oh, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador are banana plantations. They're not actual countries.
Well, they are actual countries, Ed. Come on, these are nations.
They're banana plantations run by corrupt dictators that cut money off the top of every foreign aid dollar we send to them.
Okay, so what would be a good return on investment in those countries?
Stay home, pick bananas, and be happy.
Stability. Internal stability.
Got it.
Right. You ever been to Costa Rica, Ed?
Don't want to be.
Okay. Well, it's right next door, more or less, and or Belize, for that matter. I've been in both countries. Both countries have national health care systems. Both countries have strong labor laws. Both countries have the rule of law. Both countries are peaceful. In El Salvador, you can go to college all the way up to MD, completely tuition-free. I'm not sure about Belize. I know that they've got a strong public education system. And those countries are doing well. We didn't wreck those countries. Belize is the northernmost, Costa Rica south, you know, of these countries in Central and Northern South America. But we broke these other three countries, Ed. I mean, to the extent that they're banana plantations, we made them that way. Don't we have any obligation to those people in your mind?
We made them that way because that's exactly what we want them to be.
I don't think anymore. I don't think that we're really importing much of consequence from those countries any longer. They're too chaotic. There's, you know, when was the last time you saw something that's, you know, some food in the supermarket that had the sticker "Made in Honduras" or "Grown in Honduras"?
I went to the store and bought bananas last week.
Yeah, well, maybe, okay, maybe you've got some, but you know, mostly what I'm seeing is fruit coming from Mexico, and coming from Chile, and coming from Argentina, coming from Brazil, coming from Peru. I'm not seeing so much coming from there. And I think it's because they're so unstable. 52 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back with your calls. Welcome back. 53 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Bill in Lake Elsinore, California, listening on KPFK. Hey, Bill, what's up? Crashing down. Bill, you are on the air. Okay, Bill is on line 6, Louise, if you want to check that out. Paul in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind?
Well, Tom, I was thinking as if Trump has an even chance or better to win in 2020, as you were kind of suggesting with the statistics from Wall Street or whatever.
Yeah. It was a survey of Wall Street fund managers.
Okay. Well, if that has any validity, then apparently issues are not important to the American people. And, I mean, look at it this way.
Well, hang on just a second, Paul. Whether or not more brown people are coming into the United States, in the minds of most Republicans, is an issue.
Well, that's most Republicans. But as before, Tom, the Republicans are 26% of people identify as Republicans.
27% of Americans elected voter-eligible Americans elected Donald Trump, Paul, in the last election. In the last election, it was either 26 or 27% of eligible to vote Americans voted for Donald Trump.
Right.
And you're saying that 26% of Americans call themselves Republicans. Well, that's what he won with.
Yeah, but he won. Look at it this way: he won with 46.4% of the vote to Hillary Clinton's 48 basically a 2% difference.
Right, of people who voted, yes.
Right, and so we also know that Hillary Clinton had 65 million votes thereabouts, and we know that there are at least 70 million people who are Democrats who are available to come out because Barack Obama got them in 2008.
Right.
And what I'm saying is that Donald Trump has done nothing. He's shown nothing. And the problem is that every time an issue, you bring up an issue, the Democrats bring up an issue, whether you call it Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, Social Security, it's just a target for him to throw bombs at. And that's what sells to in America today. It's culture wars. It's who won. It's not how the issue really shakes out in terms of or tax cuts. Nobody did well in the tax cuts except the super rich, and yet and people, the common person, the common middle class person realizes I really didn't get a tax cut. Yet then they walk away going, well, at least Trump won. I'm willing to have gotten shafted on that, but at least he won. Those are the Trump supporters, and I just don't see as whomever the Democrat.
Paul, what you're missing here. Paul, we only have 40 seconds left. What I think you're missing here is that for white racist Americans, and that's a large chunk of Americans, the more brown people coming in from our southern border is the issue, not just an issue.
Okay, but again, the Republicans did nothing to pass an immigration law, to pass an immigration bill. They couldn't get anything done.
No, because their base is afraid that would let more people in.
Pass a tax cut. Yeah, he's trying to make it look like and catch and release. That's what he's doing by making it look like, oh, they're storming the borders by letting the facilities become overrun, and then releasing a lot of them at one time.
Right.
You can criticize catch and release.
No, it's kind of a pump and dump scheme. I mean, it's like a bad stockbroker, but that's what he's doing. He plans in 2020, and he's said this out loud. He's going to make the entire election about immigration, and I'm saying it's about refugees, but nonetheless, he's going to make it about immigration. And according to these Wall Street guys, they think that that's going to win for him. We'll see. Paul, thank you for the call. It's extremely frustrating, but this is the reality.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
from Guns for Hire, how the CIA and U.S. Army recruit mercenaries for White Rhodesia. It's a historical reprint of what appears to be a 1979 pamphlet, basically. This is from the introduction. It does have an ISBN number. It is available in book sources. In Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, actually this must have been published post-1980 because they're referencing Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, 270,000 white settlers, mostly immigrated since World War II, controlled the government and economy, ruling over the 7 million black Africans. The Zimbabweans cannot vote. They have been forced off the bulk of the arable land, and they have no democratic rights whatsoever. All labor performance in Zimbabwe is black labor, and it is intensely exploited, often at less than subsistence wages. Zimbabweans have been fighting European invaders since the early 17th century. Since the 1890s, they have been directly ruled by Europeans, at first in the form of a private British corporation, the British South Africa Company. Since 1923, direct political rule has been in the hands of the white settlers, currently led by Ian Smith and his fascist Rhodesian Front Party. It's important to note that the white settlers were originally given this direct local power as a, quote, self-governing colony of the British government, thereby creating a master-caretaker relationship. During these past 80-odd years, Western imperialism, the multinational corporations of the United States, Britain, and South Africa, has extracted huge profits from the exploited and oppressed Zimbabwean population via the subsidiaries of the Anglo-Americans, Lonro, Amax, AMAX, Union Carbide, Mobil, ITT, and other corporations. They fully intend to continue doing so as long as they can. The white settler minority has been rewarded for their violent subjugation of the Zimbabwean people with perhaps the highest national standard of living in the world. Sir Roy Walensky, the former Prime Minister of the Central African Federation, which included what is now Rhodesia, once said, "This man Smith has an appeal. It's the appeal of an easy life. For $6,000 a year, you can have 5 servants, a swimming pool, and a lot." Beginning during the early 1960s, however, the Zimbabwean nationalist forces under the leadership of the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, evolved the strategy of guerrilla war to liberate their people and land. It is proving to be very successful. There are 20,000 guerrillas in base camps in Tanzania and Mozambique, over 3,000 in Zimbabwe itself, and this number is continually rising. In a meeting between Stephen Solars, a U.S. congressman, and the ZANU guerrilla leaders, they were reported to reject the possibility of enlisting the assistance of Cuban or other foreign troops, declaring that if we cannot liberate ourselves, we do not deserve to be liberated. Despite Western propaganda to the effect that the U.S. and British only wish to avoid a bloodshed in Rhodesia, don't forget the Zimbabweans have been bleeding for almost a century, their real fear is that the liberation struggle will win. With this victory in sight, it is not surprising that the counterattack by the Smith regime has become more vicious and brutal. Actually, this must have been published pre-1980 because this is when Smith was still in power in Rhodesia. More than 250,000 rural Zimbabweans have been forced into concentration camps. Terrorist raids have been conducted against Zimbabwean refugees in Mozambique. Dusk to dawn shoot-on-sight curfews have been instituted and enforced in the border areas. And escalating counterinsurgency attacks have been launched against the military arm of the liberation struggle, the Zimbabwean People's Army, ZIPA. It is crucial for Westerners to understand that the Smith regime has not stood alone in this barbaric campaign. This pamphlet documents the critically important element in U.S. imperialism's support for the Smith regime, white mercenary reinforcements for the fascist Rhodesian, quote, security forces. This flow of U.S. mercenaries to prop up white Rhodesia is an important, though secret, part of U.S. imperialism's strategy for Africa. The U.S. has massive investments in southern Africa. Zimbabwe alone supplies the bulk of high-grade chrome ore used in the U.S. for jet engines and other advanced technological items. Coal, copper, and other minerals are ripped out of Zimbabwe for U.S. industry. Mobil Oil, Texaco, Hertz Rent-A-Cars, Holiday Inns, and many other U.S. corporations operate illegally in Rhodesia through foreign subsidiaries. More important still is South Africa, the fortress of U.S. interests in Africa, where $1.5 billion is invested by GM, IBM, Ford, and other giant multinational corporations. The liberation of Zimbabwe would, for the first time, penetrate the buffer zone of satellite countries protecting the borders of South Africa. South African guerrilla fighters, who are already training by the thousands in camps in Tanzania and Zambia, would have direct access to re-enter their land and accelerate the liberation struggle. Knowing that the stakes are high, U.S. imperialism has worked to strengthen the white supremacist outposts in Africa, although at times this had to be done covertly. In 1970, the Nixon White House approved Henry Kissinger's Operation Tar Baby strategy, based on Option 2 of the Secret National Security Study Memorandum Number 39. This strategy essentially called for covert military assistance, including direct exchanges, so the South African troops could be trained in the U.S. in specialized tactics and weapons. This would be done while the U.S. tried to convince Africans that it was on their side. This is from the pamphlet number 39, that Kissinger memorandum. We would maintain public opposition to racial oppression, but relax political isolation and economic restrictions without openly taking a position undermining the United Kingdom and the UN on Rhodesia. We would be more flexible in our attitudes toward the Smith regime. And it goes on from there. Guns for hire. Hey, over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter. And Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's, there's just, it's there. It's there for you. And it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff. And you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. We have been talking about Kirstjen Nielsen and the Homeland Security Department and the policies that, Donald Trump's basically 2020 re-election strategy is to create as much of a crisis as he possibly can at the southern border, have as many, quote, brown people as possible come across the border. In fact, he just elevated Stephen Miller to put him in charge of immigration policy. So now Stephen Miller can call meetings and supervise things. And, this young white racist, there's a white nationalist, is Stephen Miller. And now he's in charge. As, he's kind of secondarily been in charge all along. And so anyhow, we've been talking about that and what that means and where do we go with that and what do we do about that. And this new Sophie's Choice that refugee families, and stop calling them immigrants, mainstream media. These are refugees. They are fleeing death. They are deciding that it's better for their kids to be in cages than to be murdered. So anyhow, Trump wants more refugees, so he's cutting off the very aid that Congress authorized for Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador. He's cutting off the very aid that was given to these countries to allow them to build democratic institutions, to strengthen their policing, to strengthen their legal systems, to strengthen their economies. He's cutting that off to create a crisis in these countries, even worse than the one that's been festering there since the 80s when Elliot Abrams last was committing war crimes down there. He was pardoned for that by George Herbert Walker Bush, so Trump put him in charge of Venezuela a few weeks ago. So we've been talking about that and what's going on with that and where we're going to go with that. And we've heard some amazing stories, one from a fellow who grew up in Cuba before the revolution. Meanwhile, just to add another topic to the soup here, in Vermont, and there's one other state as well as Vermont, Maine. In Maine and Vermont, if you are a felon, a convicted felon, and you are in jail, and it's the first Tuesday in November, you can vote. Now, this is true of most countries in the world that are advanced democracies. The vast majority of them. allow someone who either is in jail or has just recently gotten out of jail, basically paid their debt to society, allow them to vote. The disenfranchisement of felons in the United States goes back to the 1870s, and it's something that was put into place by white racists, largely in the South, which is why it's mostly southern states that don't let felons vote. Florida, the most notorious. And the reason why, you know, the disenfranchisement of felons, 21% of black men in Florida are felons, have a felony conviction. 1/5 of the male African-American vote in Florida may not vote because of these laws. So thus, you know, last November, there was on the ballot in Florida, shall felons be allowed to vote? And the people overwhelmingly said yes. And now the right-wing leadership of Florida, which, you know, only beat Andrew Gillum, you know, Ron DeSantis only beat Andrew Gillum by, in my opinion, voter suppression, by fraud. But the right-wing power structure of Florida is trying to execute the law in a way that doesn't actually execute the law. Well, yeah, okay, we'll let some felons vote, but we're going to make it really hard for them. Well, Bernie has come out and said everybody should be allowed to vote. If you're an American citizen, whether you're a felon or not, you should be allowed to vote. And the main reason you want everybody to be allowed to vote is so that people pay some attention to politics, so that they figure out what's going on in their country, so that they feel a commitment to their nation. They feel like they're part of the democratic, small d democratic process. I mean, this is only common sense. The whole point of forbidding felons from voting was part of a simple two-step process that emerged in the 1870s as Reconstruction started to fail in the South after Andrew Johnson, the Lincoln's vice president, became president and basically put a knife in the heart of the Reconstruction process. And the little two-step dance was really, really simple. Isolate black people and charge them with crimes, right? Oh, he's walking down the street while black. That's loitering. You are guilty. Charge them with crimes. Convict them of those crimes. If you can send them to jail, the 13th Amendment has an exception for slavery. We can still have slaves in the United States, explicitly. It's right there in the Constitution, the 13th Amendment. We can still have slaves in the United States as long as they have been convicted of a crime. Once you're convicted of a crime, you may be subject to slavery. So number one, create laws, the so-called black laws, create laws that it's really easy to break. And have those laws have fairly draconian penalties, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years in jail, that are never applied when white people break those laws, but always applied when black people break those laws. So you arrest a lot of black people, you get a lot of literally slave labor for these prison camps. Some of them are factories. Many of them are farms, plantations. They're prison plantations for that. And then when those people are out of jail, they can't vote. So the white power structure stays in power. I mean, 1 out of 5 black men in Florida, that's nothing to sneeze at, right? So Bernie comes along, and Elizabeth Warren, by the way, is supporting him and saying that everybody who is free should be able to vote. In other words, after you've gotten out of jail. She's, with regard to people in jail voting, like they do in Norway, like they do in Germany, with regard to people in jail voting, she's like, well, we need to have a conversation about that. Bernie's like, no, we do that in Vermont right now, and it works just fine. It's a good thing. You want people to feel involved with their democracy. And I agree with Bernie on this. I mean, I don't think Elizabeth Warren is disagreeing with him. She's just not quite ready to take a step that she knows will be used by the Republicans against the Democratic candidate. I mean, you know, I think she's thinking, why hand more ammunition to Donald Trump? This is low-hanging fruit from Trump's point of view. Prisoners in Trump world equals black people, and black people equals, you know, fill in the blank for Trump and Stephen Miller's worldview. Meanwhile, a few other kind of news stories that I think tie into this. 70% of Wall Street executives, they just did a big survey on Wall Street. And a new poll of Wall Street insiders, this is from CNBC, 70% of Wall Street insiders think Donald Trump is going to get reelected president. 70%, 7-0. Cool. So we've got that. And also, Mohammed bin Salman, the dictator of South America, excuse me, of Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia, has put 11 women's rights advocates in jail. And the United States just voted, our Congress just voted to not allow these to stop our support for Saudi Arabia in their war with Yemen. So what does Mohammed bin Salman do? He arrests 2 U.S. citizens along with 10 other people, throws them in jail, is preparing to torture them. It's going to be tough times. It's going to be really tough times. Stick around. We'll be back in about 4 minutes. Joe Madison's going to join us. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back. Stick around. It's 15 minutes past the hour.
Go ahead.
And welcome back. On the line with us is our old buddy Joe Madison, who's on the air on Sirius XM earlier in the morning from 6 to 10 on, what is that, channel 127? 126. Thank you. Joe, welcome back. And by the way, we will, if you can stick around, right now we're on break with Sirius XM, and I want to bring you back when we come back from this break, but we are live on our Pacifica affiliates and on Free Speech TV and whatnot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No problem.
So tell me about Louis Gates and this what's a series that he's put together, is it not?
Well, yeah. Well, you know, this is his 5th season, Tom, of Finding Your Roots. It is an amazing TBS series. He takes individuals from all around the country. Many entertainers, sometimes authors. Michael Moore has been featured. The list is. I had Valerie Jarrett on my show just recently with her new book, I Found My Voice, and she was in the earlier series, but this is his 5th year, and basically it started out DNA, you know, and breaking down what parts of the world you came from, but then they go much deeper, using census, church Bibles, birth records, and they, in essence, do your family tree as far back as the paper trail will take.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, if you haven't seen it, or you haven't, I imagine most of your listeners have, you really have to, you might want to binge.
Yeah. No, it's you told me about this the last time I saw you in D.C. and then I don't know what happened. I missed it, and I want to track it down and watch it. So I've got to do that. Yeah. Well, yeah, we were a little busy, but also and we'll reprise this in just 1 minute as we rejoin Sirius XM. But I'm curious if your callers are, what their take is on this whole immigration thing and Kirstjen Nielsen and all that.
Well, first of all, I think most of my callers, knew that, her goose was cooked months ago when Trump outed her, fronted her off, I should say, in a cabinet meeting. That was the first nail in her coffin. And I suspect, and this is all I said to my audience, I suspect she realizes she's got a career after Donald Trump. And there's just no way she's going to go down with him. Look, she knows what the law is. Everybody around him knows what the law is. But you've got the Stephen Millers of the world who are just outright anti-immigrationists. Quite candidly, I don't have a problem calling a spade a spade. They're racist. This isn't about national security. This is simply about, as you know, the fact that they don't want brown people coming into this country the way that they didn't care if Irish or Europeans came. This is all this is about. She's gone, and God bless her, and hope she has a new career somewhere.
Yeah, there you go. Amen. Joe Madison. Hang on just a second, Joe. We'll be right back. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. Stick around. Hey, over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's there's just it's there. It's there for you, and it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day. All this stuff and more, it's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff, and you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Back, Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is the great Joe Madison, who is on Sirius XM from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. every morning on channel 126. Joe.
Yes, that's right. Urban View. Mm-hmm.
Urban View, channel 126, and one of the just absolute radio greats of our era. Joe and I were just talking about essentially the racism in the White House that's driving this immigration policy, and I want to get your thoughts on that in just a second. But first off, there is a series that Louis Gates has put together. It's Louis Henry Gates Jr., isn't it, as I recall? Joe?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. There is a series that he has put together called Finding Your Roots on PBS on Tuesday evenings. That would be tomorrow night. Is your show going to be up tomorrow night on PBS?
Yes, mine. I think ours is the last episode of this new season. Mm-hmm. So you have to check your local listings, as they say with PBS, but. It's an award-winning series that, as I think you mentioned, it's in its fifth season. But absolutely fascinating. Forgive the sound. They're not coming after me.
It's all good. You're a lot louder than the noise. How did this series start, and what does he do?
Well, basically what he does is through the use of DNA, he follows your DNA, and then he has this amazing team of researchers that follow the paper trail as far back as you possibly can go. For example, Strahan, the ABC morning host, and former New York Giant, All-Pro Hall of Famer, they followed his roots all the way back to Charlemagne. He's actually a DNA cousin of Charlemagne.
Whoa!
With my roots, and they present you your family tree. This is one of the things.
Yeah, I'm fascinated to hear yours.
And mine, oh God, when he took it back to 1649.
Wow.
and that's what they do. They use census, they use church Bibles, because of particularly a lot of African Americans that weren't mentioned in the census except maybe by first name, or the fact that they were a slave or were owned by some people. But then people had their, and in Europe they did this, people would have their birth records in Bibles. And he travels all over the world. His crews, his staff, they travel all over the world, and they take your paper trail all the way back to as far as the paper trail will go until the end. And so what happened with in mine, it took me, he said, 5 years. Now, why so long? You'd have to ask him. But, with African Americans, it's very difficult. Sometimes we stop a little before the Civil War, right after the Civil War. But he was able to go way back. But the big shocker that everybody is talking about, he called me a few months ago, said he had completed the research. The DNA had been done. They had followed the paper trail, Tom. And then he said, but I've got bad news. And what I'm about to tell you is one of the most difficult things I've had to tell any guest that I've had. And that is that the man you thought was your father your entire life, biologically, is not your father.
Wow.
Then he did something that I always appreciate, and it was just decent of him. He said, if you don't want to go ahead with the episode, I will not hold it against you, and we'll just cancel it.
Yeah.
And he didn't have to do that, because when you consider the expense,
sure,
what he went through, and of course, it was just a moment pause, and I told him, no, let's do it. And then, of course, the next questions are, the people alive? Is the biological father alive? I found out I had two brothers that I didn't know, older brother and a younger brother. One lived in Los Angeles. Another one we grew up together in the same town in Dayton, Ohio. Grew up together, went to the same elementary school and the same high school.
And you didn't know he was your brother?
Nope. He knew me. I didn't know him, but he knew of me. And the part of the episode, you'll get a chance to see I guess you can't call it a reunion, because we never met. And none of us knew each other. So the younger brother didn't know about the older brother. Older brother didn't know about me and didn't know about the younger brother. So they brought us together with a film crew. And we talked and met for the first time. It's fascinating.
It sounds like it. It is.
And one grandfather was part of the Tuskegee experiment.
Oh my, that's incredible. Yeah. That is absolutely incredible.
But tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night on PBS, Finding Your Roots. Right, is the series.
Yeah.
And Joe Madison, his website, joemadison.com, Madison on SiriusXM on Twitter.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And Joe, thanks so much for being with us today and telling us about this.
Okay. All right, I'll talk to you later.
Good talking to you. Best to Sherry. We'll be back. Club book today is Last Boat Out of Shanghai by Helen Zia, the subtitle, The Epic Story of the Chinese Who Fled Mao's Revolution. This is from the prologue, Shanghai, May 4th, 1949. Bing sat up straight in the pedicab, gripping the hard seat as the driver cursed and spat. She watched with alarm as his feet, clad in sandals cut from old tires, seemed to slow to a snail's pace just when she most needed speed. This stylish-looking young woman had imagined that her last hours in Shanghai would be spent waving farewell from a ship's deck to envious onlookers below as a river breeze gently lifted her dark hair, just as she'd seen in the movies. After all, she was about to leave China's biggest, most glamorous, and most notorious city. But now, with the imminent threat of a violent communist revolution, she was running away again, along with half the city's population, it seemed. And instead of standing at the rail exchanging smiles with the ship's other passengers, she was stuck in traffic, terrified that she wouldn't reach the Shanghai Hongqiao wharf in time. That would spell disaster. She lurched forward as the pedicab driver stood on the pedals of his three-wheeled cycle and came to a stop. Around her was a sea of other pedicabs, rickshaws, cars, buses, carts, and trucks, all screeching and honking, their drivers yelling every manner of obscenity. The cacophony reverberated against the walls of the stone and concrete canyon of Nanjing Road. Bing was no stranger to Shanghai's mayhem, but she'd never seen anything quite like this. Of all times to be stuck in such bedlam, on the very day she had to get to the riverfront, the date set for her departure from this desperate city. She'd sewn her floral print quipois for this special occasion. Each careful stitch had captured her growing anticipation. With her oval face, big eyes, and full red lips, all crowned by a tiara of black permanent waves, the 20-year-old might have been mistaken for a coy Shanghai poster girl, but for the panic in her eyes. Like her, everyone in Shanghai seemed to be in a frenzy to escape, to use any means to get away from the impending arrival of the communists. But unlike those who were still clamoring for a seat to anywhere, Bing was one of the lucky ones. She possessed a precious one-way ticket out on a ship to America. Finally, the driver managed to break through the crush. He harangued everyone in his path, shouting, "Move along, you worthless mule scrotum, smellier than pig farts." She didn't blink at his choice of words, which came as naturally as breathing on Shanghai's streets. She didn't care as long as she got to the wharf. The ship's smokestacks came into view just past the stately Astor House Hotel and the towering 19-story Broadway Mansion's apartments, where the Xinjiao Creek meets the bend in the Huangpu River, the last major tributary of the mighty Yangtze River before it joins the East China Sea. Massive granite buildings, all in European style, lined the signature waterfront boulevard and docks. To the foreigners, this prime section of waterfront was known as the Bund, from a Hindustani word meaning embankment. The Chinese called it Waitan, meaning outside or foreign shore, a reference to the foreigners who once ruled this proud imperialist showcase of Shanghai. British and American businessmen had wrested away the best sections of the port city with the full support of the government. Land and sovereignty had once been ripped from China, spoils of the opium wars that had forced the narcotic onto China 100 years before. Everything about these monuments to international capitalists and pale big noses seemed foreign, including the British Big Ben chime of the giant clock tower over the customs house. Soon it would be up to the communists to decide what would follow, what would happen to these grand stone edifices. Shanghai was China's most modern, populous, and cosmopolitan city. One of the leading metropolises of the world, the Paris of the Orient was also home to tens of thousands of foreigners who were despised by imperialists by the Communist Party and its leader, Mao Zedong. The city was the launching point for major inland routes and international traffic, whether by boat, plane, train, or wooden cart, making it the epicenter for the massive exodus in the late 1940s. Stoked by the anticipated communist victory over the nationalist government headed by Chiang Kai-shek, panic and terror had first infected the wealthiest, most educated, and most privileged classes and sent them running in what they fully expected to be a brief exile. It was assumed that the communists would target the rich and the pampered in the same way that the Bolsheviks had gone after the Tsarist White Russians, many of whom had come to Shanghai as refugees from that 1917 revolution. No one knows precisely how many people fled Shanghai during the early years of the Communist Revolution. Scholars and journalists have estimated that more than 1 million people set off from or through that port city. Many of those who ran for the exits belonged to the city's capitalist and middle classes, who presumably had the most to lose under the communists. These two groups comprised about 5% and 20%, respectively, of the city's 6 million residents, or about 1.5 million people. On the other hand, the remaining 4.5 million who made up Shanghai's majority saw no need to escape. They included Shanghai's industrial workers, coolies, drivers, the destitute. But it was not only members of the upper classes who fled. They were joined by old regime loyalists, from high nationalist government officials to lowly foot soldiers, as well as those who simply got caught up in the frenzy or were especially fearful. Unfortunately, there are no records of the exodus since the retreating nationalists destroyed as many documents as they could, while the incoming communists inherited a country in such disarray that no accounting of the departures is known to have taken place. Last Boat Out of Shanghai by Helen Zia.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, your media support group for We the People. Jason in Lincoln, Nebraska. Hey, Jason, what's on your mind today? Jason? Watching on YouTube? I am not hearing Jason. Jason's on line 3, Louise, if you want to check that out. Cheryl in Portland. Hey, Cheryl, what's up?
Well, I just have a note on immigration.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about the Spanish people coming over from Mexico up.
Right.
Spain is part of Europe.
Yes, I know. Did I say Spanish people? Because I think I would have said Hispanic or Latino, or Latinx, I guess is
okay, I'm not trying to correct you or anything on it. I'm just making a note for people who think America was settled culturally only by white, like mid-Europeans.
Right.
Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese are all southern and darker.
Yes, although not that. I mean, Vicente Fox is, for example, an example of this. One of the things that I learned working in Peru, in Colombia, and in Mexico back in the 1980s when I was working with an international relief organization, Salem International, was that in all 3 of those countries where I actually was on the ground working, the local and the national political power structures and the business structures in both Peru and in Colombia, for example, you know, a lot of the meetings that we would have with people were at private clubs, and you know, the wealthy business people and whatnot, and a lot of the people involved in indigenous relief programs were typically the wives of very wealthy businessmen. They were all what you would call white. That the power structure of those countries, even though those countries are majority really indigenous people. They're the majority. They're the descendants of the Aztecs and the Mayans and the, you know, whatnot, and all these now even local tribes. That the power structures were Spanish ancestry, as in from Spain, and had skin that looked much more like mine than like the natives who basically are on the bottom of the economic, political, and social ladder in those countries. But
my main point was more to the culture. You were talking about people coming in from a different culture.
Right.
A lot of America was settled by Spanish culture.
Sure, absolutely.
And a lot of Mexico's culture is Spanish.
Yes, and that was my point, Cheryl. I think you missed my point, and that is that because these people are Catholic, by and large, and we're a Christian country, right? And Catholicism is not that different from Protestantism. Because they speak a European language, Spanish, and many of them speak English, it's not like some giant culture shock like is being absorbed by Germany and Sweden, where the people coming in not only speak a different language and have a different racial makeup, but also literally have a different culture informed by a deeply different, or in many ways different, it's also monotheistic, you know, one of the big 3 religions, but, you know, a different religion. And so the culture shock of assimilating people from south of the border is nowhere near as great as the culture shock that Northern Europe is experiencing, which means that the major difference that Stephen Miller and Donald Trump can point to, and that they constantly point to, is not one of culture, it's not one of language, and it's not one of religion, it's one of race. It's one of the color of their skin. That's why I keep saying this is all about race. This is, you know, Donald Trump is playing the white supremacist card, and that's why he's trying to get even more refugees on the southern border. And by the way, it's not the light-skinned people of Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador who are fleeing generally north, because generally those people are the middle and upper classes of those countries. They're, you know, the white power structures in those countries are very, very solidly entrenched. Including within the Catholic Church, by the way, at least from the context that I had. I met the Archbishop of Bogota. I met a number of Catholic clergy in both Colombia and in Mexico. And very, very rarely did I see, at least in the high levels of the Catholic Church where I was operating, anybody who looked like an indigenous person. So spot on. Cheryl, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Otis in Yorktown, is that Virginia or the Virgin Islands? This is VI here.
Yorktown, Virginia. That's
okay,
right.
what's up, Otis?
Colonial Triangle.
Yeah.
Pardon?
What's up?
Yeah, Newport News. You look at Williamsburg, Yorktown, Jamestown.
Okay.
The
I know where you are.
of American civilization.
Yep.
Miles away, about 22 miles away from Point Comfort, which is the 400th anniversary this year of Angela setting foot, the first female enslaved documented African that was set foot on the continent. The Angela Project is coming up. But I wanted to touch on something else because I heard you, one of the few people I've ever heard, really break down the 13th Amendment and talk about the exception clause, a 14-word exception in a 47-word Section 1 of the 13th Amendment. And you are 100% right. It is a legal basis for what is now called mass incarceration. And we know the whole lineage from convict leasing to fugitive slave laws. But I want to tell you something else, too, that I think you know because you're a constitutionalist. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment is another predicate that is used. It has an exception clause in there. And if you read through it, you may agree with me.
The word male.
That allows states to disenfranchise people who have been convicted of crimes. It seems like it's rarely implemented, but it is the legal basis on why so many states are doing that. And the other point I wanted to make is I'm an abolitionist. Therefore, there are 22 to 23 states that also have exception clauses, and Colorado was one of the first to pass legislation to stop and remove it from their state constitution. The other point I wanted to make, because I wanted to let you be able to talk about it, is in Florida, part of the reason it was passed is because they took it away from the point that you made, 20% of black males are there. It disproportionately also affected white, poor males.
Yes.
And that became a joint effort. And I can't remember the man's name. I'm sorry, because I've said it often on air when I guest host on a program called New Abolitionist Radio. But the point that they got poor people to come together in their own best interest is why it passed in Florida. And I'll send you some information via Twitter to back up what I'm saying.
Well, and I think apropos of that, Otis, that's one of the reasons why Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated when and where he was. I mean, and you know, Lamar was talking about this last, Friday of last week, as I recall, or Thursday, whatever day it was. Yeah, and that is that Martin Luther King was not sticking to the issue of black people in America. He was reaching out across the divide and saying poor whites and poor blacks share a common interest. And that's in eliminating poverty, right? Rising up out of poverty. And the institutional racism that's holding down poor blacks is not that dissimilar from the institutional obstacles to moving out of poverty that many white people face in this country as well.
And I'd like to make one other point to you because you've got a very erudite audience. Once the value of whiteness is understood not to be in the best interest of poor white people, we will see a dramatic shift in this country understanding the attack on class. Too many of us think that there is no value in whiteness, but if you look at the cultural evolution of this country, then these people can't always be said to be voting against their best interest. That's the problem I had with the hillbillyology thing, the book that came out. I don't have the proper title for it, but you know what I'm talking about, through that Rust Belt. That there is a value, social capital, into being white. And if you're poor white, you're still, quote, better than the other. And that is part of why it's hard to get a coalition, even with Reverend Barber's group.
Yeah, and this is what Lyndon Johnson was pointing out when he described. Basically, he was talking about Richard Nixon. He was and his war on drugs and his Southern strategy. And Lyndon Johnson said, if you can convince the lowest white man that he's higher than the highest black man, then he will let you pick his pocket and not complain, or words to that effect. This is not a verbatim quote, but it's damn close. And he was absolutely right. And this has been the strategy of the Republican Party literally since 1968, has been to say to poor white people, well, at least you're a whole lot better than even rich black people. And we're going to keep it that way, has been the message of the Republican Party, Otis.
And I just like to close with this. A lot of people are good on trying to be human iPods and recite historical facts. But at 66 years old, soon to be 67, if I'm fortunate enough to live until July, we have to understand what is it we can learn from history so we can change the present and the future.
Amen.
We can't keep on harping on what happened in the past because the battlefield is slowly changing. And I would submit to you, austerity has caused the migration of people all over this globe because it's a global thing now. It's not just within the bounds of a country. And we're suffering some of that same thing when you look at the southern border. The southern border didn't start now. It actually started when I was probably 25 to 27 years old, sitting underground at a missile silo because I was in Tucson, Arizona, and I saw the economic impact. And people don't understand that we are reaping a bad foreign policy and austerity and meddling in other people's business.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's why I'm calling for a Marshall Plan, a new Marshall Plan for Central America. We need to help rebuild at least these three nations that are sending so many of these refugees to us. We need to help them rebuild democratic institutions. It doesn't mean we go in and do it ourselves. That typically doesn't work. We need to. And Otis, thank you for the call, and thanks for being so spot on all of it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Good talking with you, Otis. But we need to be like we did with Germany. We will finance this, but you're going to build it yourself, so you end up with the cement factories and the steel plants when it's all done.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We're going to check in with Talk Media News. Bob Ney will be with us in about 4 minutes. Stick around. And welcome back. Mark in Delta Junction, is it Arkansas?
Nope, it's Alaska.
Alaska, okay. I thought it was a typo. It says AK, and I thought we were, okay, Delta sounds like...
all the time, Tom.
Yeah, it sounds like Arkansas. It's, anyhow, Delta Junction, Alaska. So what's on your mind, Mark?
I'm an old retired school teacher. I spent half my life up here in Alaska and teaching in Southeast Asia, but also in Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
And my old teacher buddies from Venezuela and I are really concerned about Trump taking us to war there. We're worried that he's going to turn that place into another Libya.
Yeah.
And there's an organization, or there was when I was teaching in Venezuela, called SEVAS. We have these all over the planet. It's supposed to be a joint commercial development organization between the United States and Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
It's run by a bunch of guys who are all ex-military intelligence people. I used to drink beer and shoot darts with those guys when I was roaming around South America and Central America. And it looks to us like we're going to do the same damn thing to Venezuela that we did with Mossadegh in Iran. The same set of circumstances for those of us who have lived down there seem to be happening right now.
Yeah, it's not that we're going to. We are in the middle of the process, Mark.
We're going to lose there, though, Tom. The deal is Venezuela, and I've been around Venezuela from La Frontera de Colombia to the Andes Mountains to the Llanos. They're going to make Vietnam look like Disney World. There's just a lot down, and Venezuelans are a proud and honorable people. And for decades, we've been training their military.
Yeah, yeah.
So our worry is that's what we're getting ourselves into.
Yeah, Greg Palast was on this show a little while ago, Mark, and he knows Maduro. In fact, he knew Hugo Chavez personally. And he said that if you look at the Maduro government, it is almost all people of color. If you look at this, who's the usurper? I'm forgetting.
Guaido.
Yeah, thank you. If you look at him and his government, they are all European ancestry. They're all white. And basically, it's the wealthy white power structure versus the native-based indigenous group that basically rose up and took over power there with Chavez. Does that make, is that, you know, I mean, given that you lived in the area, is that an accurate characterization?
That's exactly the case. And the fact is that we have been supporting and bolstering the right wing of Venezuela, like Colombia, for decades now.
Yeah.
But again, the worry is we're going to turn that place into, you know, another Vietnam, and it's just going to be a mess.
Yeah. Well,
and
you know,
the parting note, we appreciate the 6 or 7 progressive Alaskans that exist up here. Really appreciate your program. Thank you very much. Keep doing what you're doing, Tom.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will do my very best, and thanks for validating my perceptions and Greg's reporting. It's great to hear from you. I'm telling you, we have the most well-informed, well-traveled, thoughtful, and knowledgeable listeners and viewers on Earth. Mark, thank you again. We'll be back with Bob Ney with Talk Media News in just a moment. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. Hey, over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's you know, there's just it's there. It's there for you. And it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff. And you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Check in with Talk Media News and find out what's up in the world today. On the line with us is Bob Ney, the author of Sideswiped, former congressman from Ohio. Congressman, welcome back to the program. What's going on?
Well, Tom, let's go at least with Revolutionary Guards and immigration.
Okay.
One's international and one is domestic, and of course international.
Well, with regard to the Revolutionary Guard, as I believe you were the only member of Congress who speaks Farsi, the language spoken in Iran, and who has lived and worked in Iran. Now that Trump has declared essentially the Iranian military as a terrorist organization, A, is my characterization accurate, and B, what does that mean?
Well, it is accurate. It is now. I believe it's one of the first times we've actually declared a foreign country's military as a terrorist organization, if I'm correct, or at least in modern history here. And what it means, and look, let's clarify right off the bat: the Revolutionary Guards are no picnic in the park. Okay, you know we know there's issues and problems, but this is just another piece of the puzzle. You and I have talked about John Bolton, the National Security Advisor. You know, his goals. He has publicly said he wants Iran nuked. You know, he's been on this issue from day one. He's in the White House, et cetera. So he's behind, you know, these policies, obviously, with the Secretary of State, Pompeo, that's sympathetic to them. And what this basically means, though, is that we could have our own backlash off of it, because it's not just an issue of the Revolutionary Guards. It's the fact that anybody they work with. So, as you know, Iran is basically embedded in Iraq thanks to George Bush, 43. Iran has more control of Iraq than they've ever had, but they've also been helpful to Iraq, and in another way, they've also helped drive out our enemies, which is ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which they're also enemies of Iran. But in fact, the Lebanese army and the Iraqi army dealing with these Revolutionary Guards then become liable to have a problem with us on sanctions and fines and possible imprisonment. So we may have a backlash of our own military not being able to communicate with other certain military that we frankly need to.
So Trump's policy of trashing Iran in the desperate hope to have a war with Iran to get himself reelected, I think he's kind of given up on that and really wants to have his war with Venezuela or with refugees at the southern border. Just make sure it's somebody who's not white and not Christian, right? He doesn't care. But it seems like his efforts to demonize Iran are actually backfiring on us in Iraq. Does this put our soldiers at risk, Bob?
Oh, absolutely. It puts our military at risk. It puts our leverage at risk. It puts our ability to interact, for example, in Iraq at risk. And it goes a little step further. The Revolutionary Guards, which, again, I'm not saying they don't have problems. I'm not saying that they're a walk in the park, but they also have different interests and different organizations, and some of them functioning in Europe, which means Europeans, by the way, Europeans, legitimate business Europeans who have to deal with Iran, will in fact potentially become criminals, and some of those are our allies. So that's another area I think we have to look at. I mean, the venom towards Iran is so bad by John Bolton and Trump's advisors that it's come down to this, because this is a move. Look, President Obama thought about it. President Bush thought about it. They had discussions because this issue's been thrown around before. And they've all decided not to do it. And one of the reasons is it's an extraordinary step that, again, our own military, by the way, Tom, you'll see some stories, I guarantee you, in the next 2 days. Our own military were not supportive of this. Our military, our generals in the Pentagon, which should tell you something.
Wow, it should tell you everything. That's remarkable. What else is up, Bob?
And on a side note, too, I do argue we have to watch this because I think it's building towards, the 2020, we need to keep the commander-in-chief strong because we're in a potential war, possibly with Iran.
Yeah, I see pretty much everything Trump is doing these days as either helping his corrupt buddies or preparing for his reelection.
Right, and John Bolton's a key part of this. I know I like to use him as a punching bag, but I think he deserves it in most of these cases.
Yeah.
The immigration issue, Stephen Miller, you look at his history with Michelle Bachmann, John Shadegg, the control within the Trump organization quickly, within the White House inner circle. He's now made a full circle because the Homeland Security Secretary is out. Now Miller in the White House has been designated as the ground-on guy in the White House to make these decisions on immigration. And Miller is after not just, quote, illegal immigration, he's after immigration, period. So you're going to see a great wave of change, even stronger, towards legal immigration itself, too.
Unless it's Norway.
Stephen Miller. I'm sorry?
Unless it's Norway. Trump asked out loud, why don't we get more immigrants from Norway? Right? He wants white Europeans to immigrate into the United States. He just doesn't want brown people or Hispanics or Latinos, or Muslims or people from Africa.
Yes. And it's happening, and you're making a very legitimate point, Tom, because I'm predicting today, and I think you know this, we're going to see probably in the next 5 or 6 months hardcore statistics somehow on what's actually going on in the embassies, and it's going to center right back to Stephen Miller, the control he has, that not only of the people coming across the border and the policies, but in fact absolute legal immigration of fiancé visas, student visas, immigrations, green cards into America. You are going to see a dramatic, silent change.
Yeah, I believe you're absolutely right, Bob, and we're already seeing that. I mean, Mar-a-Lago. Trump is importing white people from Europe to work in Mar-a-Lago. He likes those immigrants or those HB1 or HB3 workers, those visa workers. But as long as they're white people, just fine. Bob Ney, thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you, Tom.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's there's just it's there. It's there for you. And it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff. And you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great. Our book today is The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America by Greg Grandin. And this is from Chapter 1, titled All That Space. The British colonies in North America were conceived in expansion. America was an aspiration, an errand, and an obligation born out of violent Christian schism and Europe's interminable religious and imperial conflicts. Depending on the intricacies of their particular interpretations of Revelation, the Protestants who settled New England might have understood flight across the Atlantic as a way of escaping European war, or they might have seen migration as a chance to open a new front and win those wars on a new soil. Here in the 1600s, in the eschatological nebula of the New World, was the first paradoxical image of America as simultaneously pristine and despoiled, empty and at the same time filled with primitives begging for deliverance, subordinated to Catholic Spain, which had conquered its part of the Americas a century earlier and stood as the great obstacle to Reformation England's rise as a world power. All yell and cry with one voice, Libertia, Libertia, Richard Hakluyt, a clergyman and court minister, wrote in the late 1500s, hoping to convince investors and his queen to establish an American colony. As Puritan society frayed under the harsh conditions of settler life, the frontier threatened and beckoned. The dark woods were filled with witches, and they were witchy, inviting hither. The forest was the place where the community could be redeemed and given new purpose, a chance to once again start anew, or it could be a place of more sorrows, wilderness sorrows, as two early Puritan patriarchs described the hardships that awaited those who ventured into uncharted territory, where whatever solidarity existed would be smashed into atoms as settlers scattered to escape the rule of the clergy. People are ready to run wild into the woods again and to be as heathenish as ever, warned Increase Mather. Expansions could be, often in the same sermon, held up as the cause of and the solution to the difficulties of establishing Christian communities. Either way, Native Americans had to get out of the way. They could die. They waste, they molder away, they disappear, said one Puritan chronicler of indigenous people who had succumbed to European pestilence years before the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620, thus clearing the earth for the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. God made way for his people by removing the heathen and planting them in the ground, said another observer. They could be murdered. The holy terror unleashed by the Puritans was, according to the historian Bernard Bailyn, driven by fears of what could happen to civilized people in an unimaginable wilderness and fears of racial conflicts in which God's children were fated to struggle with pitiless agents of Satan, pagan antichrists swarming in the world around them. Survivors could be enslaved. The first patent granted in colonial America in 1626 was to a Virginia merchant and planter, William Claiborne, for inventing a device that would not just restrain Indians, but also make them work. Claiborne was given an Indian to experiment on for the trial of his invention. Colonial records do not say what this innovation might have been, only noting that it was not successful. Or they could be pushed further and further west. The prodigious and relentless population, complained New Orleans Spanish governor in 1794, progressively drives the Indian nations before them and upon us, seeking to possess for itself this vast continent which the Indians occupy between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Appalachian Mountains. More than a century and a half later, writing in the early 1950s, the Mexican author and diplomat Octavio Paz made much the same point. America was, he writes, if anything, geography, pure space, open to human action. Since it lacked historical substance, ancient social classes, established institutions, religions, and hereditary laws, reality presented no obstacles other than natural ones. Men struggled not against history, but against nature. And wherever there was an historical obstacle, indigenous societies say, it was simply erased from history, reduced to a mere natural fact and dispensed with accordingly. Evil is outside, part of the natural world, like Indians, rivers, mountains, and other obstacles that must be domesticated or destroyed. End of quote. The American Revolution is a permanent revolution, Paz went on, a nonstop expulsion of, quote, all elements foreign to the American essence and a constant invention of itself. And anything that stands in the way of that invention, anything that is in any way irreducible or inassimilable to perpetual creation, be it Native American, Spanish America, or history itself, quote, is not American. Quote, in other places, the future is one of man's attributes because we are men, we have a future. In Saxon America, the process is inverted and the future determines the man. We are men because we are the future, and everything that has no future is not a man. End of quote. The United States, Paz said, offers no room for contradictions, ambiguity, or conflict. The nation flies forward swiftly, as if weightless across the land. Trying to stop North Americans moving west, Stephen Austin, the founder of Texas, said over a century earlier, was like trying to stop the Mississippi with a dam of straw. The drive west waxed and waned and burst forward with great passion during key moments. The book, The Edge of the Myth, by Greg Grandin.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. One of the book reports that we recorded it this morning, actually, is Igor Volsky's new book, Guns Down, How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Culture with Fewer Guns. And to our great pleasure, on the line with, and to our great benefit, on the line with us is Igor Volsky himself, the executive director of Guns Down America, gunsdownamerica.org. And the website, the book, of course, Guns Down. The website for that is gunsdownbook.com. And, of course, you can tweet Igor at IGORVOLSKY or at Guns Down America. Igor, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Tom. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. So how do we defeat the NRA and build a safer future with fewer guns? I think the predicate of this, that fewer guns means a safer America, has been largely established, although you might want to recap that very quickly. And the other predicate that the NRA requires defeating, speak to why that is necessary. Let's start with those 2 points.
Yeah, well, look, I think the big point here in terms of how do you defeat the NRA is really on us. And what I mean by that is, you know, for years, advocates of gun control, politicians who supported gun control, really pushed incremental reforms that focused on appealing to a magical moderate voter and talked about maybe a little bit of background checks, maybe we could limit some kind of the most deadly weapons. But what's clear in the research, and you allude to this, is that where there are more guns, there are more gun deaths of every kind, from suicides to homicides to accidental shootings to police shootings, both you shooting at police and police shooting at you. And, you know, of course, you look all around the world and you see the way countries have reduced gun deaths. They have things like gun licensing, gun buybacks, gun registration. And so in this book, I argue that's where we need to be. That's what we need to ask for if we want to, A, defeat the NRA, and then, B, really start saving lives in America.
Yeah. So step one, reduce the number of guns in circulation. Step two, deal with the NRA.
What is the NRA these days? I remember the NRA from when I was a little kid. I mean, literally back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, as the organization that did, training on safe firearms use. And in fact, I remember the early 1970s, the NRA was supportive of gun control legislation. What happened?
Well, what really surprised me, Tom, is that that is certainly the public story. That until 1977, when the NRA really had a revolution of leadership, that before then, that it was an association that believed in some sensible gun control. And that's true to a point. And that's to say that publicly, that's the image they portrayed. But what I learned in researching this book is that privately, what they told their membership was always the same. I actually found evidence the first time the NRA came out against a gun control law was, I believe, in 1911 in New York. And then again, publicly they were saying one thing, but privately they were telling their membership, that they have to write their lawmakers to oppose this measure because it would only take guns away from the good guys and leave the bad guys armed. And what happened in 77 is that those private messages and those public messages merged, and the NRA became what it is today. But this sense that, they at one point were this great hunting club, I think the narrative there is a little more complicated because politically the message has been the same.
Yeah. The modern day meme, and whenever I discuss guns on this program, I inevitably will get a call from somebody saying, well, the founders wanted us to have guns. They put the Second Amendment in there in case the government ever became tyrannical so we could take down the government. I mean, after all, these were revolutionaries. They had taken down a government of their own, right, or that opposed them. And I have to point out to them that, in all of James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, in all of Jefferson's letters, and Hamilton's writings, you can go through. I mean, take your pick. There literally is no American history indicating, not a single one that I could find, indicating that any of the founders or framers thought that Americans should be armed to take down the government that they themselves were in the process of creating. But, this story appears to have begun with an article in, I think it was 1974, in the American Rifleman, the NRA magazine, written by a teenager. Am I remembering that right?
Well, I don't know about the teenager piece, but what is certainly true is that this idea of the Second Amendment guaranteeing individual gun rights and thus superseding any kind of gun control laws, you're exactly right to point out that that's a very modern idea that came about in the 1970s because, as this revolution was happening within the leadership, because what was happening before then is that the old NRA leaders would publicly write in their materials that the Second Amendment was of no use to them in trying to push their agenda. And that's because the consensus, both the legal consensus, the public consensus, the consensus within the Supreme Court for many, many, many years was that, as you point out, this was a right that was confined within a militia, right? It's how the Founding Fathers really thought about it. And it's also why you had a lot of colonies, and also as the country began to expand west, they had some pretty strict gun control laws because they too understood that where there are fewer guns, there are fewer gun deaths.
Right, right. It's pretty remarkable. We're talking with Igor Volsky. His new book is Guns Down: How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Future with Fewer Guns. So how do we defeat the NRA, Igor?
Well, look, it's gonna take a long time. I'm under no illusion that we're going to be able to do this tomorrow. But look, step one is asking for what we really want and really building a movement in this country to vote people out of office who take dollars from the NRA and really tap into the great support that you have in this country for things like licensing and registration. Step two is I talk a lot about in the book of looking at non-legislative strategies to defeat the NRA and also take on the gun industry. And what my organization did last week is that we launched a campaign, Tom, that's pushing the 15 largest banks to stop doing business with the gun industry until that industry can be fundamentally reformed. Because as you know, they made a business decision in the late 80s, early 90s to start producing weapons, militarized weapons for the civilian market. That gave us the popularization of the assault weapons, but also these military-style handguns. Folks are dying from wounds they were surviving generations before. And so, you know, we're always looking, and the book talks about this, looking at how can you find other actors in society, whether it be corporate America or other voices, to begin to change the conversation and the culture around guns so that you begin to give politicians the room to take on the lobby politically and to do that more directly. But it's going to be a long process. I wish I could tell you that there was some kind of magic switch, but there really isn't. They've been successful for so long. And if we're serious about it, and again, if we ask for what we want, which is fewer guns, we can get there sooner rather than later.
Right. Igor, back in the 1990s, there was, well, I remember actually back in the 80s, when I think the Pillar House restaurant in Boston was one of the very first restaurants, literally white tablecloth restaurants in the United States, to go entirely smoke-free. And it was slowly spreading through the late 80s and into the 90s. But then with these lawsuits and these pictures of diseased lungs, explicit photographs, really gross photographs coming out and being promoted in television ads and things by anti-tobacco groups, and then the lawsuits that showed the death, the carnage of cigarettes, the tobacco lobby went from, in 1995, being literally the most powerful lobby in Washington, D.C., to in 2005 being one of the least powerful. Might not a similar strategy, particularly showing pictures of the kind of damage that gunshots do? We've got this now hashtag movement, My Last Shot, that the kids, the now, you know, teenage kids from Newtown have been promoting to, please, if I'm killed with a gun, show the picture. Do what Emmett Till's mother did. What do you think about a cultural revolution that could change our take on guns as rapidly as happened with tobacco, completely independent of the political sphere?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Tom. And that's the kind of strategies that I'm talking about, to really show people what guns do to the human body. And that's, by the way, as we unroll our banking campaign, we're going to integrate those kinds of strategies into it. But, you know, a part of all of that is really reframing the conversation, because, you know, for the last 20 years, and I just came back from Littleton, Colorado, the site of Columbine that occurred 20 years ago, believe it or not. Right. For those 20 years, our politicians and the gun control movement talked about, and still talks about, taking guns out of the hands of dangerous people. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense, particularly in a country where 2/3 of the gun deaths are suicides. The way the rest of the world has solved this problem is that they've recognized that guns are the problem. Guns are inherently dangerous in any civilian hands, and we need to change the environment in which they're purchased by raising the standard of gun ownership. And that's how you keep everybody safe. And so the kinds of techniques that you're talking about are really showing people what gunshot wounds look like. That's really critical to reframing the way our leaders talk about this issue.
Yeah, I really think it is. The book is Guns Down: How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Future with Fewer Guns by Igor Volsky. And Igor, thank you so much for dropping by today.
Such a pleasure. Thank you, Tom.
My pleasure, too. And Igor is also the executive director of GunsDownAmerica.org and his website, gunsdownbook.com. So check those out, and you can tweet him at Igor Volsky, Volsky. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. And welcome back. James in Mineola, Texas. Hey, James, what's on your mind today?
Hold on just a second. Let me get off speaker real quick. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
I wanted to ask you, do you have like black friends?
Yeah.
What did they tell you about the immigration thing?
I'm not sure I've had that conversation with anybody who's black recently.
Well,
what's your point, James?
Because there are a lot of black people. I like Otis called earlier.
Mm-hmm.
He listened to Yvette Carnell as well, and he knows how she feels about immigration. And it just seems like every time you sit there and say you're against immigration, or that much immigration,
right,
somehow you're labeled as a racist or, a Trump supporter.
Right.
You don't have to be a Trump supporter in order to believe that the illegal immigration is hurting your community.
Well, it's not so much illegal immigration, it's people hiring illegal immigrants. But if what you're talking about is the economic impact of all this.
I'm saying that to translate from paperwork from English to Spanish costs. I'm saying when they go to the hospital, it costs. I'm saying when they're in your schools, it costs. I'm saying all that. I'm saying when they go get gas,
James, the math has been done. The amount of money that quote illegal immigrants end quote, that undocumented people who are working in this country, the amount of money that they're paying into Social Security and they're paying in taxes is greater than the expense, those costs. The one area where you can build a case that there's a cost is when labor markets are not tight, and particularly people at the bottom of the economic pile, which would be poor black people, poor white people, are finding that the jobs that might have been available to them are being taken by people who are in this country illegally because they're willing to work for even less than minimum wage as long as it's under the table. And
I got one other question for you.
And that's something that we need to do away with. We need to end that. I get that.
Okay, I got one other question. You're talking about rebuilding their countries down there, right?
Yeah.
But don't you think America has a responsibility to rebuild the American black families and stuff first, or the black community
absolutely.
first?
The average white family in the United States has around $80,000 worth of equity, essentially, wealth. The average black family in the United States, it's around $5,000 worth of wealth. That disparity is purely the result of 5 centuries or 4 centuries of slavery and then institutionalized, racism isn't even the right word,
So
apartheid.
make me understand this then. So when you say that just that easily, why can't your guy Bernie Sanders understand that?
He does. That's why he supports reparations.
No, he did not.
And he's not my guy. He's I've not endorsed anybody in the primaries. I think Bernie's probably the strongest candidate, and he's certainly the front runner right now. But I'm telling you, James, every single progressive in the field gets it. They all get it, that this is the legacy of racism in the United States, and we need to do something about it. The discussion we need to have in the United States, and this is what everybody is encouraging, frankly, everybody from Kamala Harris to Bernie Sanders to Elizabeth Warren, is how do we go about doing this? Right? I mean, this was a small piece of the conversation around the Great Society back in the mid-'60s. How do we go about making right what was and is to this day wrong? And there is a lot of ideas and a lot of different ways to do it. And it's a conversation that we need to have. We absolutely need to have, James. And tragically, the word reparations is being used by Trump and white racists, and they will be using it aggressively in the coming election as a way of saying to white people, we're going to take your money as taxes and give it to undeserving black people. Hey, over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's it's there. It's there for you, and it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day. All this stuff and more, it's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out. and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff, and you'll find it all right there on our website at thomhartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom
Here
Hartmann
with you,
Program.
David in Columbus, Ohio. Hey, David, thanks for listening to WGRN. What's on your mind today?
Hi, I was listening with interest to the NRA discussion.
Yeah, the conversation with Igor Volsky about his new book, Guns Down, yeah.
Right. I think one issue that doesn't get much mention is the proliferation of military weapons just by the military. I mean, there's constant wars, and there's constant production of weapons. Those weapons just don't disappear. They exist, and they're constantly moving around, and the United States gets a good percentage of them. And then also Hollywood in every single movie has to have a gun somewhere.
Yeah.
I think we need to reduce that so that people think, oh, you can't solve problems with guns. I mean, that doesn't work. So I think there's another angle to this that needs to be considered, not just the political side. I think the NRA gets some exposure, but very little to the average person. The big exposure is, like I said, with Hollywood and the military.
Yeah, I'm with you. And the Hollywood part, I don't have an easy answer or solution to that. It is, it's going to require some self-policing or some blowback. And, I haven't seen much of that yet, but, who knows? With regard to the military, Ronald Reagan started this program. I think it was called the 1090 program. I always think of it as 1099, which is an IRS, it's how you list wages, not regular wages. But it had a four-digit acronym that has a 1 and a 9 in it. And what this program did is it allowed local police departments to get weapons, quote, surplus weapons from the military, or even directly from defense contractors themselves with a massive federal subsidy. And so the result of that was that police departments in small-town America are getting half-tracks and Humvees and military vehicles and high-powered rifles and body armor. And, I mean, they're building SWAT teams in places where you would never need a SWAT team. And then because they've got it, they're using it to issue, like, summonses and divorce decrees and things. I mean, it's totally bizarre, but it's leading to a lot of American deaths. And that program has exploded the number of defense contractors that are selling directly to these small town and big town police departments, stuff that they never really should have. We shouldn't have weapons of war in our cities, whether they're handled by the cops or by the bad guys.
Right. That's exactly right. I know a specific example on that, where a rural county bought a armored car, and I talked to the county commissioner. She said, why did they need an armored car? They got rid of it, but that kind of silliness doesn't make any sense. Yeah. When you strap on all this stuff, all the helmets, all the black vests and the bulletproof vests and all that weaponry, you're going to use it.
Yeah, well, and it alters psychology, actually. When people dress like that, it's a real interesting thing to try. I mean, dressing up like a soldier, dressing up like a police officer actually changes people's psychology and makes people more authoritarian and more assertive, particularly men. And, this is a problem. David, thank you for the call. We don't need more stormtroopers in America. It's 27 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Exposing the con in conservative. Thom Hartmann here with you. We'll be right back. We're reading today from Truth in Our Times by David E. McCraw, Deputy General Counsel of the New York Times, the #2 lawyer for the New York Times. This is in Chapter 1, titled Election Day. It opens with a tweet from Donald Trump. The failing New York Times has been wrong about me from the very beginning. Sadly, I would lose the primaries. Oh, said I would lose the primaries on the general election. Fake news.
November 8, 2016. At 10 p.m., I made one last circuit of the newsroom. Our CEO, Mark Thompson, stood near the political desk, looking on with his wife and a small group of others connected somehow to the Times. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan remained in doubt, but the reality was sinking in. Donald Trump was on the verge of winning the American presidency. I'd been in newsrooms on election nights before. I know how it's supposed to be. The only thing that ever mattered was the horse race, think Gore-Bush, or the historic moment, think Obama-McCain. There was no investment in which candidate was winning. He or she was destined to disappoint in the long run. And the dominant emotion was a certain not quite cynical detachment amid the electric buzz of the vote count and projections and the anticipation of relief that the endless push of the campaign was finally over. Sure, you couldn't ignore the victories or the big picture moments, and the day after stories would be celebratory in their way, duly restrained but with a nod to victory itself. Not unlike the next day account of a Super Bowl game or Game 7 of the World Series. Capture the triumph for a night or relish the race too close to call. Leave the dancing and crying for others, for the believers. But this night was like no other election night. There had been an investment, not just journalistic, but spiritual. Donald Trump had campaigned not just against Hillary Clinton, but also against the New York Times and the American press, the mainstream American press. And his astonishing rise to the top of the Republican Party had been built on his near daily attacks on facts, on the very idea that facts matter. For journalists who approach truth like a secular religion and who have seen 1,000 times how a single true story could gut the political career of a lying politician, it had been a year of faith-shaking disbelief. A line had not just been crossed, but obliterated. The shock was palpable as the numbers came in, laced for some with the fading hope for a different outcome among people who generally wanted nothing more than a story worth telling. And there was still a paper to put out, a reckoning to account for. It was too much on an already long night. I slipped away. At the elevators, I ran into Sue Craig and a guy who was obviously not from the Times. Sue had broken one of the biggest stories of the campaign. She was the one who went to her mailbox one day in September and found pages from Donald Trump's tax returns in an envelope. She introduced me to her acquaintance. He had once worked for Trump. I didn't ask why he was there. Like me, Sue had decided to get away. "It's too weird here," she said. We all got on the elevator. Sue, who had written a devastating story about Trump, me, whose letter to Trump's lawyers had lit up the internet for a week in October, and one of Trump's guys. We rode in silence, a strange tableau on the strangest night of the year. 14 hours earlier, as I came into the building, the Times security guard had called me over. They wanted to make sure I knew about the plans for the next morning. In the quirky ways that things happen at the Times, I had become the lawyer to see for all the things that security guys encountered, from the intruder who pilfered women's shoes to the anonymous letter weaponized with razor blades. The Times was printing thousands of extra newspapers, and tables were going to be set up outside for all the people who would be showing up to buy the New York Times for posterity's sake. The headline, I later learned, was going to read, "Madam President." We had been caught flat-footed 8 years earlier when Barack Obama had made history. By the time I arrived for work early in the morning of the 2008 election, the line was already starting to snake down the sidewalk. Soon there were hundreds of Obama supporters who thought, and why wouldn't they, that the place to buy a copy of the New York Times was surely at the New York Times. Lots of things happen at the Times building. Selling newspapers is not one of them. Employees were pressed into emergency duty to cart bundles of newspapers from the Times printing plant in Queens, and the long lines outside the building stretched on into the afternoon. But it was Obama's victory in 2012 that was on my mind this morning. I vote in a neighborhood that is predominantly black and middle class. In 2012, following a drumbeat of stories about how Republicans hoped to suppress voter turnout, I walked into my polling place at a local school 8 minutes after it opened. The line already extended back to the schoolhouse door. "Did y'all sleep here?" a guy wanted to know as he stepped into the foyer. On this morning in 2016, I had arrived before dawn. I was the only one in line at my precinct's table. That all seemed like a strangely distant memory as midnight approached. I had made my escape from the building with Sue and the Trump guy. At home, I sat alone in the glow of the TV screens as the states that mattered fell into place for the Republicans. I turned it off. Donald Trump was about to become president of the United States. The next morning, in a light drizzle on a gray November day, the newspaper sales tables were set up outside the building as planned. No one stopped. The vendors sat idly amid the stacks. There was no Madam President front page. Instead, the headline read, "Trump triumphs," and the first two paragraphs of the lead story talked about how the vote threatened convulsions throughout the country and made an early mention of those who had watched with alarm the rise of Trump. Nearly half the country had voted for the man. I had just spent a weekend in October back in rural Illinois, in my hometown, and for a moment I allowed myself to see the coverage through the eyes of the rest of America, where, at least for this one night, his victory represented a certain kind of hope that change was going to come at last. Truth in Our Times by David McCraw.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thom Hartmann here with you. Fred Guttenberg, who I believe is one of the parents of one of the Newtown parents. I might be wrong on that. He might be one of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas parents. Just tweeted, this is an important tweet. The tweet is from NORA. It's Wells Fargo is the leading financier of the gun industry. If you care about gun violence, perhaps you should take your business and your investments elsewhere. He tweets, this is an important tweet. When other banks stepped up to drop the gun industry, Wells Fargo stepped in. If you still bank with Wells Fargo, you should switch. Amen. So, you know, and by the way, small banks, small local banks, credit unions are co-ops. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. So anyhow, Rich in Mission Viejo, California. Hey, Rich, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I'm really glad to talk to you. Basically, I wanted to talk about the militarization of the police.
Yeah.
And there was a burn bill that was pushed by Joe Biden, and he was the one that pushed all of the military hardware into the police. And if they
Wait a minute, a burn bill. What does that mean?
It was a burn bill that was pushed by Joe Biden to the president, okay, Obama. And what happened was this gave, it was, I think, $1 billion or whatever of military hardware to the police. And if they didn't use it, they would have to give it back, okay? And this is why you had all of these raids where you would have, you know, a summons served by people that were a SWAT team, okay? And
right, somebody's $200 in debt, and to enforce the court order, they show up with 30 cops and a SWAT team.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, they broke into a mayor's house down in Maryland, okay, and they thought he was a drug dealer, and he wasn't. It was another guy that was killed because he made a bet, okay, with a police officer. I mean, there's a really good book, The Militarization of the Police,
right.
And I forget who wrote it. I was looking all over for the title of the book. In a book, I think I lent it to somebody, and I didn't get it back yet.
Right.
But it's a really, really good book, and it tells you exactly, you know, all the different. Well, not all, but many of the different horror stories.
So what I don't understand, Rich, you mentioned Joe Biden and you mentioned this phrase burn bill, and I don't understand exactly why. Is this a good piece of legislation or a bad piece of legislation? What does burn bill mean, and why was Joe Biden pushing it?
I don't know why he was pushing it, but what it did is it pushed military hardware to the police, okay?
Okay, so this passed Congress.
Ever since, yeah, and they've been using it ever since. And they've been using it.
I thought that started during the Reagan administration, Rich.
Yeah, I know it may have started during the Reagan, but Joe Biden pushed this thing, and it was the burn bill.
Okay, I got it, Rich. Thanks. And you know, to the extent that we get partisans calling into this program on behalf of or in opposition to any Democratic nominee for president. I just want to put a cautionary note out there. We are not doing circular firing squad on this program. If you're calling to trash Joe Biden, or Bernie Sanders for that matter, we had somebody earlier calling to trash Bernie. And it's because, you know, you're supporting, don't even try. I mean, obviously, if that was his mission, he just did it. But I'm going to get increasingly rigid about this as time goes on. We cannot, you know, Obama warned about this. He says, you know, look out for the circular firing squad. Now, he specifically said the lefties, or words to that effect. I'm frankly concerned right across the spectrum. We need to end the Trump presidency at the ballot box in 2020. Trump, Pence, the Republican control of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, a whole bunch of them. We need to vote them out. And we're not going to do that if we're constantly fighting with each other. Brad in Elk Grove Village, Illinois. Hey, Brad, what's on your mind?
I think
the increasing militarization of the police, donning body armor, helmets, everything. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, it would seem to me that it demonizes whom you're pointing the guns at as the enemy, whether they have any ill intent toward you or not.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. The other big concern that I have...
You're more likely to dehumanize the enemy, you know, whatever they say, you are going to think it's wrong no matter. So it makes the people you're arresting the enemy.
Yeah, or the other. Yeah, you're right. And once somebody is clearly identified as the other, then, you know, dealing with them, in quotes, in ways that might not be normal is perfectly acceptable. And I share your concern about that in pop culture, in the way that we see cops treating people in the movies and on TV. Louise and I were, you know, when we were kids, there was this show, Hawaii Five-0, and that we really liked. And when we ended up both having surgery, we were binge watching the modern version of Hawaii Five-0 while recovering. And I was just astonished that repeatedly the police in Honolulu, according to this television program, were beating up people in interrogation rooms. In one case, Lieutenant McGarrett, or Commander McGarrett, or whatever his title was, shot a guy in the knee while in the interrogation room because the guy wouldn't answer his questions. I mean, this is like extremely illegal. And my concern is not so much that the American public is being caused to think that, as Brad was just saying, those people, in quotes, you know, the criminals, are so worthy of you know, being injured or being hurt that, you know, it's no big deal. My biggest concern is that regular, normal, ordinary, everyday cops, police officers, are watching these shows, and who wouldn't, right? I mean, if there was a show about a talk show host, I'd be watching it. Wouldn't I be curious, right? How does this industry work? What do people say? What do people do? So police officers are overrepresented among the people who watch cop shows. And the cop shows are setting a terrible example. They're basically establishing new norms for behavior among our police departments. And, you know, I saw the same thing in an episode of NCIS the other day where what's his name, Gibbs, is interrogating a guy. The guy's not responding to him, so he takes his ballpoint pen and runs it right through smashes it right through the guy's hand, pierces his hand, right, stabs him. And I'm like, wait a minute. I don't want our, you know, none of us want our police officers to be behaving like that. That is, you know, that is absolutely a violation of the Constitution. It's absolutely a violation of the principles on which this country was founded. It's a violation of absolutely everything that we hold as values in this country. And yet that kind of violation is routinely shown on television as, well, here's how you become a real cop to our police. Cheryl in Morning View, Kentucky. Hey, Cheryl, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, it's actually Carol.
Carol,
and I'm calling. I was listening to George Stephanopoulos' show yesterday, and he interviewed Andrew Wang, and I found that there was one comment that seemed very ironic to me, that he mentioned that there were white nationalists supporting Andrew Wang and were saying things about Trump. Is that possible? Did you find that?
Yeah, the weird thing about white nationalists that most people don't know, well, Wang is talking about guaranteed basic income, and a lot of white nationalists are poor. They're poor white people.
Okay.
And so they're like, oh, he wants to give us money. But the Andrew Yang, I'm sorry, what did I say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Andrew Yang, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
But the other thing about Andrew Yang is that he's Asian. And there's actually this racial hierarchy that white supremacists hold to. And they believe, some of them believe, and you will find this in their literature and you will find it in their doctrines, some of them believe that intellectually, Asians, and in some cases Sephardic Jews, are superior to garden variety European white people. And so, I mean, it's weird. But, you know, it's like the hypersexualization of Asian women, too. I mean, there's all these weird racial stereotypes floating around, and those are among them.
Okay, because I thought, geez, this is something that could actually cut into the base that seems to be written in stone for the 37%.
Trump's base?
I mean,
yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think anybody wants to embrace them and say that they support it.
That's an interesting. It's an interesting question, Cheryl. We've had Andrew Yang on this program. We should probably get him back and ask him specifically about that, because it is fascinating stuff. Cheryl, I had to move along, but thank you for the call and thanks for the question. It's a very thoughtful one. Victor in Irvine, California. Hey, Victor, what's on your mind today?
I'm doing well. It's not California, it's Delaware.
Oh, okay. Irvine, Delaware. Cool. What's up?
So I really love the topic today, and I think it addressed a lot of stuff. But
are you talking about the gun violence issue or one of the other topics we've talked about?
Well, gun violence and how it's portrayed in the on the media, through the media.
Right.
I think it's done carelessly, and I agree with you 100% that when you have a show about cops, because there's so many cop shows on the TV now, more so than any I've seen in the 45 years that I've been on this earth, and I think you're right to say that these cops, they look at this and that's a kind of a signal to them that this type of behavior is good.
Yeah.
And
it's not just normal; it's celebrated.
Exactly.
It's worse than even normalization.
And I feel like almost every state we're operating under a military environment with these police officers being armed and policing us the way they do.
Yeah.
So I don't know what's the solution, because on the other side of it, or the argument is that the reason why they have these arms is because the bad guys, in quotes, are armed to the T.
Right.
But there should. That's what I'm assuming. That's what the SWAT team is for. So I don't understand why these everyday cops are walking around with or have access to these high-power weapons.
Yeah, SWAT teams were originally conceived as, I think the S in SWAT is strategic, as a group of, particularly with, snipers and things, as a group of people who could deal with extreme situations. But because so many police departments around the United States have developed SWAT teams, they've got to find something for them to do, and so they've got them serving summonses and things, and people are dying as a consequence of it. People, through a SWAT team inappropriately showing up at the wrong address, or people responding to them in ways that cause them to use violence. You're right, Victor. We are looking at the militarization of American policing, and it really started in the 80s during the Reagan administration and went on steroids in the early 90s during the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, with this massive transfer of semi-automatic weapons from the military to the police. Victor, thank you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And it's something we really need to re-examine. We'll be back. Welcome back. Barbara in Sun City, Arizona. Hey, Barbara, what's on your mind today?
Hi. Just briefly, the toughening up of Homeland Security and ICE, I think has a lot to do with the recent Supreme Court ruling that indefinite detention of immigrants, that is just this draconian measure, Preep versus Nielsen, that overturned the Ninth Circuit in California, that there's no bond. I mean, that's just slave labor. I mean, come on across the border, even if you're not, even if you have some old court record, they'll pick you up, you're in jail, and you're there for as long as they feel like keeping you.
Right, and we had a caller earlier, I think his name was Otis, who was talking about how in the 14th Amendment, there is this exception to equal protection under the law, which says that if you have engaged in rebellion or other crimes, and so because crossing the border is a misdemeanor, it's a minor crime, but it is a, quote, crime. There are
Right.
now some people, and actually one or two people among the presidential candidates on the Democratic side, who are saying it's time to, this is Julian Castro's whole thing, it's time to decriminalize this. That is, make it still a violation, but make it a purely civil violation. It's no longer a, quote, crime, which means that you can no longer put people into involuntary slavery, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, Arizona, we had Joe Arpaio, and they just used, you know, all of the, they had a labor, you know, I mean, they used forced labor.
Yeah, Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. That was the slogan over.
I'm Jewish and immigrant.
Yeah,
I mean,
you know what I'm talking about.
Emily.
Yeah. So you're familiar with the German phrase, and that's the argument, by the way, that conservatives are making for these work camps and for these private for-profit prisons that have, quote, work functions is, oh, well, we're just trying to get people ready to reintegrate back into the society, and we're just teaching them useful skills and things like that.
Right, but this ruling is really draconian. I mean, this is really bad ruling.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree.
And I think it's why he's toughening up. It's like, and it's Nielsen, you know, I mean, it's her name on it, but I guess, and then the getting rid of the guy that they wanted for Homeland Security for somebody who's tougher.
Right.
He's toughening up. It's like, great.
Yeah.
You know.
What does that mean? Well, and now he's fired the head of the Secret Service, too, or he's asked for his resignation. And
Yeah, I mean, he's just scary as could be. And Miller, you know, I mean, what the heck is that? The Jewish kid who I lived in Santa Monica when he was in high school was like, what?
There were Jews in the Third Reich.
I know.
I mean, most of them didn't last past about 1939 or 1940, but there were Jews in the higher levels of the Third Reich, and it's.
Well, Breitbart used to be in they still are in Santa Monica, and I think he was an experiment, like Trading Places, the movie. We can turn this little Jewish kid into a Nazi.
Wow, that's pretty grim.
I know.
That is pretty grim. Barbara, thank you for the call, and thanks for watching Free Speech TV. It's we'll see how it all shakes out, but go back and read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and notice what happened when Hitler finally seized complete control of the security apparatus of the German state. It was not pretty. It led right to the SS. It's 9 minutes before the hour. We'll be right back. Hey, over at ThomHartmann.com, we've got some really cool stuff. A lot of people don't realize that we produce a daily newsletter, and Sue puts we call it Sue's Daily Stack on there, which is literally a link to every story that I've talked about in the show. So all the research is right there. It's free. We don't share or sell our subscriber list. It's there's just it's there. It's there for you. And it's over at ThomHartmann.com. You can sign up for the free newsletter. You also can get my big picture take of the day, which is exclusively over at our website at ThomHartmann.com, as well as links to our videos, the book reports we typically do every day, all this stuff and more. It's all there at ThomHartmann.com. So check it out and sign up for our newsletter. I think you'll really enjoy it and appreciate it and find a lot of value there. We put a lot of work into this stuff. And you'll find it all right there on our website at ThomHartmann.com. And be sure to check out the newsletter and sign up for it. It's great. .com/. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Steve in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind today?
Thank you very much for taking my call. 50 old, but for 63 years, I've been an activist, and almost everything that you...
I'm listening, Steve. Steve, I'm sorry. You killed that, Nate. Thank you. Sam in Canton, North Carolina. Steve, thank you for the call. I know you were well-intentioned. Sam, what's on your mind?
Yeah, Trump says he wants to go in a tougher direction with the immigration thing. Mm-hmm. We've already got concentration camps. What's this next step? Is he talking about firing squads and gas chambers? Is he talking about putting machine gun nests all along the border?
Well, they did fire tear gas at refugees a little while ago. You'll recall.
Yeah, and I'm a history buff, but if you look at the logical progression of this kind of thing, the good people in Germany had no idea what Hitler was going to do when he came into power.
Yeah, but by 1938, they had a pretty good idea what was going on.
Yeah, not only could it happen here, it may well be happening here, and that's pretty scary.
Yeah.
And then they're militarizing the police. What are they going to come after us next?
Well, in some cases they are. I mean, talk to anybody who was a protester during the Vietnam War, or anybody who has participated in anti-fascist demonstrations. We now know that the Department of Homeland Security was pitching the idea that the real problem, in terms of these public protests like we had in Charlottesville, was not the fascists. It wasn't the neo-Nazis. It was the anti-fascists. They're the ones that we have to worry about, according to DHS.
The people that were holding hands and saying, "Let's try to get along and love one another."
That's correct.
Yeah, we're really the big problem there, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're really the big problem, aren't we?
Yeah. No, it really is concerning, Sam. It really genuinely is. Thanks a lot for the call. Marta in Big Bear Lake, California. Hey, Marta, what's on your mind today?
Well, I was a bilingual teacher in California for 7 years, and I was immersed in a racist system. And I think that, we have a very complex system of oppression, but also if we could look at our modern history, including NAFTA, it's somewhat, like our system of slavery in that it's, racism is based on an economic system. And like slavery, we both exploit Mexican immigrant labor, but also despise immigrants at the same time.
Right.
And NAFTA had horrendous effects on the indigenous communities in Mexico and the mestizos.
Yeah, over a million farmers lost their land because of NAFTA in Mexico, because of our subsidies to corn in particular.
Right, and exactly, and we exploit, and I don't say we, but our industries have also completely devastated the people in Chiapas who had a communal land system, and NAFTA, did away with that, made it illegal. Also, going into indigenous mountain communities and just cutting down all their trees that they, the animals that they eat, need those trees, but we want our toilet paper in the United States, so we need our paper towels. So it just goes, NAFTA just continued a long history, and we've also trained the military in Mexico. I met somebody who was involved in the military, going down there and secretly training the police and the military to...
Well, we do it right up front at the School of the Americas in Bennington, Georgia.
Exactly. And, Chiapas was repressed with, not just the Chiapas, the Zapatista uprising, but, many other progressive social movements.
Right. How dare those people create a commune? I mean, that's the bottom line. Marta, thank you for the call. You're spot on. And at the core of all of this is not just colonialism and not just, dysfunctional capitalism, but a fundamental core, simmering, boiling racism. And it's something that we need to face. We need to clear it out of our bloodstream, or out of our body politic. And frankly, we need to atone for it. And we can continue that conversation tomorrow. It's the end of the show. Thanks so much for being with us. And don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.